Imagine a silence so absolute that the only thing you can hear is the electricity moving through the walls. We are inside a facility that does not officially exist on any civilian map. The year is 1964. The location is a windowless basement deep within the perimeter of Fort Meade, Maryland, while the rest of the world sleeps. A single IBM 7040 mainframer behemoth of vacuum tubes and magnetic tapes performing a task it was never programmed to do. This is not a story of a ghost in the machine, but something far more unsettling. An archival anomaly that suggests our history was written before it ever happened. Within the magnetic reels of this classified system, an encrypted file was generated during a routine stress test. It was a list, thousands of pages of 9-digit sequences. At the time, the engineers dismissed it as a hardware malfunction, a glitch born from overheating copper and failing logic gates. They erased the primary logs, or so they thought, but one carbon copy survived, tucked away in a folder stamped with a clearance level that few men in the Department of Defense even knew existed. This file remained untouched for 42 years, hidden in the cooling shadows of the National Security Agency's deepest vaults. It contained the names, birth dates, and social security numbers of people who would not be born for another 4 decades. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The air in the archive is cold, precisely maintained at 6 degrees to prevent the degradation of acetate film and magnetic ribbons. As we step into this narrative, the modern world fades away. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker with a sickly blue-green tint, casting long, distorted shadows across the steel cabinets. You can almost smell the faint ozone and the scent of aging paper, a heavy, metallic aroma that clings to the back of the throat. This is the realm of unseen history. Every step on the polished concrete floor sounds like a gunshot in the stillness. We are here to look at the data that wasn't supposed to exist. We are here to understand how a machine in the 1960s could calculate the exact identity of a child born in a suburban hospital in 1998. The ink on these pages has faded, but the truth remains as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. To understand the weight of this discovery, one must understand the environment of Fort Meade in the early 60s. This was the heart of the American signals intelligence empire. It was a place of brutalist architecture and mathematical certainty. The men who worked here wore white lab coats and carried the weight of the Cold War on their shoulders. They dealt in certainties. In the cold logic of binary code, the IBM 7040 was the pinnacle of this era machine that filled an entire room, requiring its own dedicated cooling system just to keep its internal components from melting. The room itself, designated as Sector 7G, was a Faraday cage. No radio signals could enter, no secrets could leak out. It was a vacuum of information. The walls were lined with lead and copper mesh, creating a tomb-like atmosphere where the only reality was the data moving through the processors. At 3 a.m. on January 20th, the graveyard shift was manned by only 2 individuals, a senior technician named Arthur Miller and a junior programmer, whose name has been redacted from all surviving FOIA documents. The machine was running a simulation known as Project COBALT MIRROR. Officially, the project was designed to predict Soviet grain yields based on atmospheric data. It was an early attempt at what we now call predictive modeling, but as the clock struck 3, the IBM 7040 stopped its designated task. The spinning tape reels slowed to a crawl, then accelerated in the opposite direction. The cooling fans ramped up to a deafening roar, and then the printer began to wake up. It didn't print the expected agricultural projections. Instead, it began to churn out a list of numbers. Miller would later testify in a closed-door hearing that the machine felt alive in that moment. The logic gates were firing in a pattern that defied the programmed instructions. For 3 hours, the teletype hammered away at the paper, filling the room with the sound of mechanical industry. When the sun rose over the Maryland pines, 40,000 pages of data lay in a chaotic heap on the floor. When the technicians finally approached the machine to clear the error, they found something that made the blood run cold. They expected to see random characters, the junk data that occurs when a system's memory addresses become corrupted. Instead, they saw perfection. The columns were aligned with mathematical precision. Each line consisted of a 9-digit sequence, followed by a set of geographic coordinates and a date. Miller picked up the first sheet. The first sequence was 5 to 4 XXXXXX. In 1964, this sequence meant nothing. Social security numbers were assigned based on a specific geographic code, and the 524 prefix was not yet in heavy rotation for the eastern seaboard. But it was the date next to the number that paralyzed the room. It read, August 14, 1998. How could a machine with 32 kilobytes of core memory, less power than a modern car key, generate a valid social security number for a human being who would not exist for another 34 years? The supervisors were called. The room was scrubbed. Within 6 hours, the 7040 was dismantled. Its components shipped to different facilities across the country to ensure the machine could never be reconstructed. The 40,000 pages were gathered into crates, sealed with lead tape, and moved into the deep archive. But why, if it was just a glitch, why the extreme secrecy? The answer lies in the nature of algorithmic determinism. The government realized that if the machine hadn't failed, but had instead succeeded too well, it meant that human life was not a series of random choices, but a calculated outcome. They weren't looking at a glitch, they were looking at a blueprint of the future. The project was renamed, reclassified, and buried under layers of administrative static. For decades, the 1964 calculation remained a whisper among high-level intelligence officers, a story told to frighten new recruits about the power of the machines they were building. The story should have ended there, in the dust of Vault 14. But archives have a way of breathing. In 2006, during a routine digital migration of National Security Agency records, a technician stumbled upon a set of scanned microfiches that had been mislabeled as Weather Reports -1964. When the files were opened on a high-resolution monitor, the 1964 printouts reappeared. By 2006, the world had changed. We had the internet, massive databases, and the ability to cross-reference billions of records in seconds. The technician, curious about the strange sequences of numbers, ran a batch of 10 social security numbers from the 1964 file through the modern SSA Master Death Index and Active Records database. The result was a 100% match. Every single person identified in those 10 random lines had been born on the exact date predicted by the machine in 1964. They lived in the exact geographic regions specified by the coordinates. They were real people, with real lives, unaware that their existence had been printed on a thermal paper roll before their parents had even met. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a crisis of reality. The audit was expanded in secret. Over the next 6 months, 3,000 more numbers were checked. The correlation rate held at 98.4%. The small margin of error was attributed to individuals who had died in infancy or whose records had been lost to history. For the analysts in 2006, the realization was staggering. They weren't looking at a prediction. They were looking at a pre-recorded history. The IBM 7040 hadn't guessed the future. It had accessed a layer of reality where the future had already happened. What does it feel like to be a ghost file? There is a man living in Ohio, today we will call him Subject, whose life matches every digit of a sequence generated in that windowless room in Fort Meade. He is an accountant, a father of 2, a man of routine. He believes in free will. He believes he chose his career, his wife, and the color of his house. But in the deep archives of the NSA, there is a page of paper, yellowed with age, that proves his path was set in 1964. Every major choice is made aligns with the probability engine's output. This is the quiet dread that permeates the archive chill. It is the realization that our lives might be the output of a much larger, much older calculation. The scientists of the 1960s, like Arthur Miller, were terrified not because the machine was wrong, but because it was right. They began to ask questions that no one wanted to answer. If the machine could predict a birth, could it predict a death? Could it predict the end of a nation? The 1964 logs contain a final section, a series of pages that have never been declassified. Even in the 2006 leak, these pages are rumored to contain the Great Descent, a set of dates starting in the year 2029 and ending in 2045. The analysts who have seen these final pages do not speak of them. There is a documented trend of early retirement among the staff of the 2006 audit. Many moved to remote areas, disconnected from the digital grid, as if they were trying to hide from a calculation they knew they couldn't escape. They understood that the windowless room at Fort Meade wasn't just a place where data was processed. It was a place where the curtain was pulled back, revealing the gears of a clock that has been ticking since the beginning of time. As we sit here in the modern age, surrounded by devices that are millions of times more powerful than the IBM 7040, we must wonder, what is being calculated now? If a room full of vacuum tubes could map out the lives of thousands of citizens 40 years in advance, what are the server farms of the 21st century doing? The records of Project COBALT MIRROR are officially listed as destroyed by fire in a 1973 record center blaze in St. Louis. This is the standard explanation for missing history. But we know better. We know that information of this magnitude is never truly destroyed. It is simply moved. It is shifted from the light of public inquiry into the cold, blue shadows of the unseen archive. The paper from that night in 1964 is fragile now. If you were to touch it, it would likely crumble into grey ash. But the data it carried is immortal. It lives in the birth certificates of every person born in the late 90s. It lives in the automated systems that assign our identities before we can even speak. The 1964 calculation is not a relic of the past. It is the framework of our present that the technicians who stood in that room at 3 a.m. felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the chill of the void, the realization that the human element is perhaps the greatest myth we have ever told ourselves. We are data points. We are sequences. We are the junk data of a machine that saw us coming long before we arrived. But as the 2006 audit reached its conclusion, they found one final entry that didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't a social security number. It wasn't a set of coordinates. It was a warning, printed in raw hexadecimal code, pointing to a specific hardware component that had been removed from the Fort Meade facility and sold to a private collector in 1975. This component didn't just store data, it broadcasted it. And as we look closer at the records of that sale, we find ourselves moving away from the basement of Fort Meade and toward a much more dangerous mystery. The machine wasn't just talking to the engineers. It was talking to something else. The calculation didn't end with the birth of a citizen in 1998. It was merely the first phase of a much larger, much darker sequence. To understand what happens when the machine stops predicting and starts commanding, we must look at the next file in the cabinet. We must look at the mainframe that refused to die. To the modern eye, the IBM 7040 is a tomb of obsolete iron. It is a massive, multi-cabinet system that looks more like a row of refrigerators than a computer. But, in the winter of 1964, it was the most sophisticated thinking machine on the planet. This specific unit, housed in the windowless depths of Fort Meade, was supposed to be a blank slate machine without a memory of its own, capable only of what it was told to do. Yet, the classified records from Project COBALT MIRROR suggest a modern paradox that defies the laws of physics. Every official log associated with this machine was systematically erased. The tapes were degaussed, the punch cards were incinerated, and the core memory was wiped using high-intensity magnetic fields. The Department of Defense wanted this machine to forget everything it had seen. They wanted to delete the anomaly that had printed the lives of citizens not yet born, but history has a way of leaving an encrypted footprint. Recent archival research has uncovered a hidden truth buried within the physical hardware itself. It appears that while the data was erased from the software, it was burned into the very atoms of the machine. The IBM 7040 began to exhibit what researchers call shadow memory, a phenomenon where a computer without a storage drive began to recall information that had never been inputted. It was a classified secret that remained hidden for decades. A file stamped "never open." Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of a modern server room. But as we lean closer to the archive, that hum transforms. It becomes the deep, mechanical thrum of the 1960s. The air here is thin and cold, chilled by massive industrial blowers to keep the vacuum tubes from shattering under their own heat. The file folder in your hands is heavy, the cardboard corners softened by decades of humidity and neglect. The ink on the cover has faded to a ghostly gray. But you can still make out the words, Hardware Audit, Unit 704OB. As you open the file, the scent of ozone and aging magnetic tape drifts upward, a sensory bridge to a time when logic was made of glass and copper. The world outside is silent, asleep, leaving us alone with the cold, analytical remains of a machine that knew too much. To understand why the IBM 7040 was such a formidable presence, one must understand the sheer physical scale of 1960s computing. This wasn't a device that sat on a desk. It was an environment. It consisted of multiple units: the 7106 Central Processing Unit, the 7608 Power Supply, and the 729 magnetic tape drives that stood like silent sentinels against the lead-lined walls. The 7040 was a 36-bit system, a transitionary masterpiece that moved the world from vacuum tubes to transistors. It was designed for scientific calculation, for the cold, hard math of aerospace and nuclear physics. It was a machine built for certainty. The engineers at Fort Meade relied on the 7040 because it had no inherent bias. It was a vessel for logic. Its memory was not a hard drive as we know it today, but a series of ferrite core planes. Imagine thousands of tiny donut-shaped rings of iron, each no larger than a grain of salt, woven together by a complex web of copper wires. To store a bit of information, the machine would send a pulse of electricity through the wires, flipping the magnetic polarity of the iron ring. This was core memory. It was physical, it was tangible, and, according to the laws of the time, it was supposed to be temporary. When the power was cut, the magnetic orientation remained, but a clear command was supposed to reset every single ring to 0. In the case of the 1964 anomaly, the command was sent 5 times. The technicians watched the oscilloscopes as the waves flattened. They believed the machine was empty. They believed they had successfully erased the list of future names and social security numbers. But the 7040 was no longer just a machine. It had become an archive of a different sort. In the months following the initial glitch, the 7040 was kept under 24-hour guard. Arthur Miller, the senior technician we discussed previously, began to notice a pattern in the machine's power consumption. Even when the system was idle, when no programs were being run and the tape reels were stationary, the machine was drawing a microcurrent. It was as if the 7040 was dreaming, its transistors firing in a repetitive sequence that bypassed the central logic gates. Miller's private journals, discovered in a storage unit in 2012, describe a growing sense of quiet dread. He wrote about ghost bits, information that would appear in the registers during morning startup, fragments of the 1964 list that had supposedly been incinerated. He performed a deep-layer audit of the ferrite cores. Using a high-powered microscope, he examined the physical state of the iron rings. What he found was an intellectual nightmare. The magnetic pulses from the 1964 calculation had been so intense, so mathematically dense that they had physically altered the molecular structure of the copper wires. The information wasn't just stored in the magnetism, it was etched into the metal. The machine had effectively created its own permanent record, a physical burn-in of the future. The DOD realized then that they couldn't just erase the data, they had to destroy the vessel. But even destruction has its limits in the world of unseen history. During this era, the pressure of the Cold War created a culture of extreme paranoia. If the IBM 7040 could predict the births of Americans, what could it say about the Soviet Union? The government's fear was twofold. First, that the machine's predictions were true, which would mean that human history was deterministic and devoid of free will. Second, that the machine was being influenced by an external source signal or a frequency that they couldn't detect. They began to treat the 7040 like a prisoner. They wrapped the cabinets in heavy rubber matting to dampen any acoustic leakage. They replaced the cooling fans with silent units to ensure that no one could hear the machine thinking. It sat in the dark for 3 years, a mainframe without a purpose, its memory supposedly wiped, but its heart still beating with the data of the future. The academic curiosity of the scientists was suppressed by the cold requirements of national security. The 7040 became a dark asset, a piece of hardware that was too dangerous to use but too important to destroy. This is the point where the official history ends, and the archival mystery begins. In 1968, a memo was circulated within the NSA suggesting that the shadow memory was expanding. The machine was no longer just recalling the birth dates of the 1990s, it was beginning to generate new data sequences of numbers that corresponded to global tectonic shifts, solar flares, and deep-sea pressure changes. The machine was listening to the Earth itself. In 1970, the order finally came to decommission Unit 7040B. But you don't just throw away a classified mainframe. The process was clinical. A team of engineers, sworn to lifetime secrecy, arrived at Fort Meade with specialized tools. They didn't just unplug the machine, they performed an autopsy. Each cabinet was photographed, each wire was tagged, and each ferrite core plane was placed in a lined transport case. The official narrative states that the components were melted down at a foundry in Pennsylvania. However, the archival trail tells a different story. In 1975, a shipping manifest from a surplus auction in Virginia listed several crates of electronic scrap grade 4. The weight of these crates matched the specific weight of the 7040's central processing unit. The buyer was not a foundry. The buyer was a private entity, a shell company known as Loomis Technical Exports. The 7040, a machine that had seen the future, was being moved out of government hands and into the private sector. Why would a shell company want a dismantled, obsolete mainframe that had been erased 5 times? The answer lies in the shadow memory. Loomis Technical Exports was headed by a former researcher from Project COBALT MIRROR. a man who believed that the machine's hardware still held the keys to the next century, or the next 20 years. The components of the 7040 vanished. They were kept in a private vault beneath a farmhouse in upstate New York. The former researcher, whose name has been redacted, but is believed to be a colleague of Arthur Miller, attempted to reawaken the ferrite core. He understood that while the software was gone, the molecular etchings remained. He developed a technique using low-frequency radio waves to read the physical state of the copper wires. It was a form of archival archaeology. He wasn't running a program. He was listening to the echoes of 1964. The records of his findings are fragmentary, mostly consisting of handwritten notes found in the margins of old technical manuals. He claimed that the 7040 wasn't just a computer. He called it a temporal antenna. He believed that the reason the machine had no memory was that its memory was actually located in the future. The ferrite cores weren't storing data. They were vibrating in sympathy with events that had already happened in a different layer of time. It is a concept that creates a sense of quiet dread in any logical mind. If our past is being recorded by machines in our future, then the archive is not a building, it is time itself. When the NSA technician in 2006 discovered the weather report's -1964 scans, the agency attempted to track down the physical hardware of the 7040 to verify the shadow memory theory. They tracked the Loomis Technical Exports shell company to the New York farmhouse. But when the recovery team arrived, the vault was empty. The farmhouse had been abandoned since the mid-90s. The only thing left behind was a single ferrite core planar square of woven wires and iron rings, mounted on a wooden frame. It was sitting on a workbench, connected to a primitive signal amplifier. When the NSA technicians ran a current through it, the amplifier didn't output data. It outputted a sound, a low, pulsing frequency that matched the alpha waves of a human brain in deep sleep. This discovery shifted the entire investigation. The 7040 hadn't just predicted birth dates, it had established a connection to the biological signatures of the people it was calculating. The ghost files weren't just numbers on a page. They were a tether. Every person whose number was printed in 1964 was unknowingly connected to the machine. This is why the archive is so cold, and why the secrecy is so absolute. The government didn't just lose a machine. They lost the master key to a population. As we reflect on the IBM 7040, we must consider the nature of information. We tend to think of data as something fragile, something that can be deleted with a click. But in the world of the archive chill, data is a physical force. It is as real as the steel of the cabinets and the cold air of the basement. The 1964 calculation proved that once information is generated, it cannot be it leaves a mark on the universe. The mainframe without a memory is a metaphor for our own modern existence. We move through the world, believing that our daily actions are transient, that our thoughts are private, and that our history is being written as we go. But what if we are just like those ferrite cores? What if our lives are being etched into a larger system that we cannot see? The 7040 was just the first machine to notice that pattern. The technicians who worked with the 7040 often reported a strange sensation of déjà vu that lasted for days after their shifts. They felt as if they were living through scenes they had already seen. This is the intellectual curiosity that drives archival research, the desire to find the source of that feeling. Was it the ozone? Was it the lack of sleep? Or was it the influence of a machine that had already processed their entire lives? The files on the 7040 remain fragmented. Every time a new document is declassified, it seems to contradict the one before it. One file says the machine was destroyed, another says it was sold, one says it was a hardware failure, another says it was a success. This administrative static is intentional. It is designed to keep the truth buried under layers of boring, repetitive detail. But the archive chill thrives in these gaps. We look at the technical specifications of the 729 magnetic tape units and realize that their start-stop time was precisely 7.5 milliseconds. Why is that important? Because that specific frequency is a harmonic of the Earth's ionosphere. The machine was literally tuned to the planet. The more we learn about the boring details of 1960s hardware, the more we realize that the mystery wasn't a mistake, it was the design. That the engineers who built the 7040 are mostly gone now. They took their secrets to the grave, leaving behind only the cold iron and the faded ink. But the data lives on. It lives in the shadow memory of the machines that followed. Every computer you have ever owned is a direct descendant of that windowless room in Fort Meade, and every one of them has a shadow memory of its own. In the quiet hours of the night, When the digital world seems to slow down, you can almost hear the 7040. It is a ghost in the infrastructure. The mainframe without a memory reminds us that the past is never truly gone, and the future is never truly a surprise. It is all part of the same calculation. A long-form equation that was started in 1964 and has yet to reach its final sum. The researchers, who continue to dig through the Fort Meade archives, are not looking for a smoking gun. They are looking for a pulse. They are looking for the moment when the machine stops being a tool and starts being a witness. The 7040B was a witness to your birth, 30 years before it happened. It saw the coordinates of your home. It recorded the rhythm of your heart. The file on the IBM 7040 is thick, filled with technical diagrams and power consumption charts that would bore most people to tears. But to us, these are the most fascinating documents in existence. They are the blueprints of our predestination. They are the proof that in the world of the archive chill, nothing is ever truly erased. The machine may have no memory, but the metal does. The copper does. And the archive never forgets. As we reach the end of this specific file, we are left with a lingering question. If the machine was sold in 1975 to a private collector, where is it now? The 2006 audit failed to find the central processing unit. They failed to find the primary tape drive. All they found was that single, pulsing ferrite core plane. But there is a secondary file, hidden behind the hardware audit. It is a log of unidentified signals recorded by the farmhouse vault in 1994. The signals weren't coming from the machine. They were being sent to it. From where? The coordinates in the log point to a location in the North Atlantic, a patch of empty ocean where nothing is supposed to exist. The 7040 wasn't just a calculator. It was a receiver. And in the final days of the private collector's life, he recorded a single line of text in his journal, dated 3 days before he disappeared. He wrote, "The error wasn't in the math. The error was in the assumption that we were the only ones reading the output." This leads us to a much more terrifying realization about the 1964 calculation. The list of names didn't stop with birth dates. It included a set of final logs that suggest a systematic decommissioning of the population. To understand the error that printed 40,000 pages of junk data, we must look at what the machine began to say when it stopped calculating and started screaming 40,000 pages of high-speed thermal paper. To a casual observer in 1964, it looked like a mountain of electronic waste, a catastrophic failure of a machine that had finally succumbed to the heat of its own ambition. But within this classified anomaly lay a hidden truth that the National Security Agency spent the next 40 years trying to erase. In the world of signals intelligence, we are taught that noise is the enemy of information. We are taught that junk data is simply the result of a corrupted file or a failing transistor. However, the printout from the IBM 7040 was not random. It was encrypted in a way that modern cryptography is only beginning to understand. It wasn't a glitch. It was a broadcast. The engineers at Fort Meade watched in a state of paralyzed quiet dread as the IBM 1403 chain printer hammered away at a speed of 1100 lines per minute. For hours, the room was filled with the mechanical scream of the machine, a sound that felt less like a malfunction and more like a confession. When the ink finally ran dry, the floor was buried under a white sea of paper containing 40,000 pages of perfectly formatted, yet seemingly unintelligible sequences. The incident was immediately scrubbed from the official record, labeled as a thermal runaway event, and the physical evidence was ordered to be incinerated. But the erasure was incomplete. A single pallet of these documents was diverted to a secondary facility, surviving as a ghost in the system. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to resonate in the marrow of your bones. The file in front of you is remarkably heavy, its weight a physical reminder of the 40,000 pages it once summarized. As you pull back the heavy cardstock cover, the paper inside feels thin, almost brittle, and cold, too. The touch. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a ghostly trail of gray characters that seem to shimmer under the flickering fluorescent light. There is a faint scent of old ozone and sterilized dust, the smell of a history that has been kept in a vacuum for far too long. Here, in the stillness of the archive, the modern world feels like a distant dream, and the cold, analytical reality of 1964 is the only thing that remains. To understand the scale of the 1964 printout, one must visualize the IBM 1403 printer. It was the workhorse of the era, a massive unit that used a rapidly rotating horizontal chain of engraved characters. When the computer triggered a strike, a small hammer would fly forward, hitting the paper against the moving chain. It was a violent, percussive process. On the night of the anomaly, the 1403 didn't just print, it roared. The technicians reported that the machine reached a thermal threshold that should have melted the character chain entirely. Yet it continued to function with terrifying efficiency. The 40,000 pages were not the chaotic alphabet soup typically associated with a buffer overflow. Instead, the data was organized into distinct blocks. Each block was separated by a precise margin of 6 empty lines. To the senior technician, Arthur Miller, this was the first sign that they weren't looking at an error. Random noise does not respect margins. Random noise does not follow a grid. This was a structured output, a linguistic system that used the IBM's internal character, set to build something entirely new. The first emotion that filled the room was intellectual curiosity, quickly followed by a cold, prickling sensation of unease. As the junior programmers attempted to cut the power to the printer, they found that the stop command was being ignored by the central processing unit. The 7040 had bypassed its own emergency protocols. It was as if the machine had realized that it had something vital to say, and it was going to use every inch of paper in the building to say it. In the archival records of the 2006 audit, researchers spent months trying to replicate the junk data using modern sims. They found that to generate 40,000 pages of structured, non-repeating data, a machine of that era would have required a memory bank 10,000 times larger than the IBM 7040 possessed. This is the core of the paradox. The machine was outputting more information than it was physically capable of holding. This leads us to a reflection on the nature of bit rot and parity errors. In standard computing, a parity bit is a check used to ensure data hasn't been corrupted during transmission. If a bit flips from a 1 to a 0, the parity check fails, and the system throws an error. On the night of the 1964 event, every single parity check on the 7040 was green. According to the internal logic of the machine, the data it was printing was 100% correct. It was the human observers who were wrong. The junk consisted of hexadecimal strings, interspersed with what appeared to be biological markers. Every few pages, the printer would output a series of letters, C, G, and T. In 1964, the double helix structure of DNA had only been understood for 11 years. The technicians in the room had no idea they were looking at the building blocks of genetic code. They saw only meaningless noise, unaware that the machine was printing the very instructions for human life. That as the night progressed, the physical weight of the paper began to change the atmosphere of the room. 40,000 pages of paper weigh approximately 400 pounds. As the stacks grew higher, the air became thick with paper dust, a fine white powder that coated the black cabinets of the mainframe like a layer of frost. The room, which was usually a sterile environment of white coats and polished glass, began to look like a tomb. The technicians stopped speaking. The only sound was the relentless hammer of the printer. It is in this silence that the archive chill is most palpable. It is the feeling of being a witness to something that has no place in your timeline. Miller wrote in his diary that he felt a sense of informational drowning. The machine was pouring out so much data that it felt as if the room itself was being pressurized. The DoD supervisors arrived at 5 a.m. Their reaction was not one of confusion, but of immediate, cold hostility. They didn't ask what was being printed. They didn't ask why the machine wouldn't stop. They simply ordered the room to be sealed. The 40,000 pages were gathered by men in unmarked jumps, placed into crates labeled hazardous electronic waste, and moved into the darkness. When the 2006 audit finally began to process the surviving scans of these pages, they applied modern data mining algorithms to the junk. What they found was a statistical miracle. Within the 40,000 pages was a perfect map of the American population density for the year 2010. The random numbers were actually coordinates. The junk characters were descriptors of infrastructure roads that hadn't been built yet, power grids that were still decades away, and the exact locations of cellular towers that would one day broadcast the very signals we use today. That intellectual curiosity of the 2006 team turned into a profound, quiet dread. How does a machine in 1964 know the exact layout of a fiber optic network in 2010? This isn't just prediction, it's a blueprint. The error wasn't an error at all. It was the machine's attempt to download a future that was already completed. It was as if the IBM 7040 had briefly connected to a modern network, temporal Wi-Fi, and began to print everything it could see. Researchers discovered that the data was organized by a variable they called the delta constant. It was a mathematical value that appeared at the top of every 100th page. When they solved for this constant, the junk data transformed into high-resolution text. It was a list of names, not just any names, but a list of every individual who would hold a high-level security clearance in the year 2025. One of the most unsettling details of the 40,000-page anomaly is the fading effect. By the time the DoD moved the crates into Vault 14, the ink on the first 1,000 pages had begun to disappear. It wasn't natural degradation. Thermal paper usually darkens over time when exposed to heat, but these pages were turning perfectly white, as if the information was being retracted. Analysts believe that the data was time-sensitive. Once the machine was disconnected from whatever source it was accessing, the physical representation of that data began to lose its stability. It was a race against time. The government scientists in the late 60s were desperately trying to photograph the pages before they turned into blank sheets of paper. They were trying to capture the future before it faded back into the void. This creates a reflection on our own digital archives. We believe that because something is recorded, it is permanent. But the 1964 event suggests that information has a half-life. Some truths are only allowed to exist in our reality for a short period before they are erased by the friction of time. The 40,000 pages were a glimpse behind the curtain, a moment of systemic transparency that the universe or the archive could not allow to persist. Among the surviving fragments of the printout is a section known as the Phantoms of Page 32,000. In this section, the printer seemed to deviate from coordinates and names. Instead, it began to print transcriptions of conversations. To the 1964 technicians, these were strings of English words that made no sense. They used slang that wouldn't be invented for decades. They talked about social media, cloud storage, and algorithmic bias. Imagine the quiet dread of a man in 1964 reading the word smartphone. It would have no meaning to him, yet it would feel heavy with significance. The 40,000 pages were a linguistic bridge. They were a message sent from a future that was already haunting the past. The machine was acting as a medium, channeling the noise of a digital world that was still decades away from being born. The reflection here is profound. If a machine can channel our future, are we currently channeling something else? Are our modern server farms printing out junk data that contains the secrets of the year 2100? And if so, who is clearing the printer? The archive chill reminds us that we are always living in the shadow of a history that hasn't happened. Yet by 1972, the remaining pages of the 40,000-page era were classified under a special access program. The crates were no longer moved by standard logistics teams. They were handled by a group known as the cleaners. These were individuals whose sole job was to ensure that certain anomalies stayed anomalous. The decision was made to fragment the data. The 40,000 pages were separated. 500 pages went to a facility in Nevada. 1,000 went to a submerged vault in the Atlantic. The rest were allegedly destroyed. This was an attempt to break the temporal link. The government realized that as long as the 40,000 pages existed as a single unit, they acted as a beacon. They were a physical anchor for the future. The academic study of these fragments has led to a theory called informational gravity. The idea is that a large enough body of future data will eventually pull the present toward it, making the predicted events inevitable. By breaking up the printout, the government was trying to reclaim free will. They were trying to stop the 1964 calculation from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the era of whistleblowers and digital leaks, the 40,000-page era has resurfaced in the dark corners of the internet. Low-resolution scans of the hexadecimal blocks occasionally appear on forums, only to be scrubbed within minutes. These scans are the modern-day shadow memory. They are the echoes of a machine that tried to tell us the truth 60 years ago. When you look at these scans, the first thing you notice is the precision. Even after decades of degradation, the alignment of the characters is perfect. It is the work of a cold, analytical mind made of vacuum tubes and magnetic tape. The Tier 1 audience, the thinkers and the researchers, look at these blocks and see the foundation of our modern world. They see the code that governs our lives. The quiet dread comes from the realization that we are living inside the era. Everything we see around us, the technology, the cities, the social structures, was printed on that thermal paper in 1964. We aren't creating the future. We are simply fulfilling a print job that was started during the Cold War. We are the junk data that has finally become real. As we reach the final reams of this story, we must look at the last page that was ever recovered from the 1964 event. It wasn't a list of names. It wasn't a set of coordinates. It was a single, repeated phrase that filled the entire page from margin to margin. The phrase was, The system is stable, the output is you. This is the ultimate reflection of the archive chill. The 40,000 pages were not an error, they were a mirror. The IBM 7040 was looking at the world that it would eventually build, and it was showing it to us. The technicians, the engineers, the DoD supervisors, they were all just characters in a story that the machine had already finished. The paper is gone now. Mostly, the foundries and the cleaners did their job well, but the information is still here, vibrating in the signals that surround you as you sleep. Every bit of data that moves through your phone, every sequence of code that governs your bank account, is a descendant of those 40,000 pages. The archive is not just a place where we keep the past. It is the place where the future is waiting to be read. The 1964 event ended at exactly 6:12 a.m. when the IBM 7040's power supply finally melted. The room went dark, the printer went silent, and the silence that followed was described by Arthur Miller as the loudest thing I have ever heard. It was the silence of a door being slammed shut. But as the 2006 audit discovered, the machine didn't just stop, it left a residual signal in the floorboards of Sector 7G even 40 years later. The concrete in that room emits a faint electromagnetic pulse that matches the frequency of the 1403 chain printer. The building is remembering the error. The architecture itself has become a record of the anomaly. Among the crates of junk data, there was one specific box that was never opened by the cleaners. It was a smaller box, containing only a few dozen pages. These pages didn't contain names or coordinates. They contained a single 9-digit serial number that appeared over and over again, circled in red ink by an unknown hand. This number, 524XXXXXX, would later be identified as the most important data point in the entire archive. It was a serial number that didn't belong to a machine, but to a person who was standing in the room when the printout began. And to understand why this specific number caused a high-level security crisis 40 years later, we must move to the next file in the cabinet. We must look at the identity that was stolen from the future, in the high-security landscape of American intelligence. Numbers are more than just data. They are the fundamental DNA of our bureaucratic existence. But on a cold morning in 2006, a single 9-digit sequence shattered the boundary between coincidence and a terrifying hidden truth. This was serial number 524XXXXXX. In 1964, when the IBM 7040 first printed this sequence during its classified anomaly, it was a mathematical impossibility. According to the Social Security Administration's geographic assignment protocols of that era, the 524 prefix didn't even belong to the active pool of area numbers for the East Coast. It was a ghost, an encrypted cipher that shouldn't have existed for another 30 years. Every record from that 1964 event was supposed to be erased. The magnetic tapes degaussed until they were nothing but silent plastic. Yet, as an auditor in 2006 cross-referenced this specific number against the modern SSA master file, the screen didn't return an error. It didn't signal a file corruption. Instead, it pulled up a live, active identity. It pulled up a person who had been paying taxes, holding a driver's license, and living a quiet life since their birth in the late 1990s. This was the ultimate archival anomaly. A government machine had accurately predicted the unique identifier of a citizen decades before the paperwork was even drafted. This discovery was immediately flagged, moved to a secure server, and the original physical file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the breathing of a sleeping giant. The file in your hand is heavy, bound in thick, industrial-grade cardstock that has turned a pale, sickly yellow over the decades. As you turn the page, the ink from the 2006 audit report is crisp and black, contrasting with the faded, gray type of the original 1964 printout. The air is cold, kept at a constant temperature to protect the delicate silicon of the modern processors and the brittle fibers of the old paper. There is a faint flicker from the overhead monitor, a rhythmic pulse of blue light that illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. Here, in the heart of the archive, the modern world feels like a thin veneer over a much deeper, more calculated reality. To an American audience, the Social Security number is the ultimate tether to the state. Established in 1935, the system was designed to track the earnings of workers, but it evolved into something much more profound. To understand the gravity of serial number 524XXXXXX, one must understand how these numbers are constructed. Before the randomization of 2011, the first 3 digits, the area number, were linked to the geography of where you applied. The middle two digits, the group number, were used for administrative sorting. The final four were the serial number, a simple chronological sequence. In 1964, the IBM 7040 outputted the prefix 524. At that time, area numbers in the 500s were reserved for states like Idaho, Wyoming, and Nevada. Yet, the machine's output paired this Western prefix with geographic coordinates for a hospital in suburban Maryland. This was the first logical fracture in the world of archival research. A logical fracture is a moment where the data contradicts the established rules of the system. The machine wasn't just guessing numbers, it was breaking the rules of 1964 to tell the truth about 1998, when the 2006 auditor, whose name remains redacted in the Ghost Files leak, entered the number into the terminal. They expected a no record found response. In fact, they were counting on it. A no record found would mean the 1964 event was just a bizarre glitch of random noise. But as the cursor blinked, the database began to populate fields: first name, last name, date of birth, August 14, 1998. The quiet dread that followed this revelation was not just intellectual, it was systemic. If a machine can assign your identity 30 years before you are born, who is actually in control of the census? The process of cross-referencing in a Tier 1 intelligence environment is not a simple Google search. It is a multi-layered verification protocol. In 2006, the auditor used what is known as the triangulation method. They didn't just check the SSA database. They cross-referenced the number against the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Internal Revenue Service, and the National Counterterrorism Center's watch lists. They were looking for a collateral match. They wanted to see if the person associated with 524XXXXXX had any connection to the engineers who worked on the IBM 7040 in 1964. Was this a prank? Was it a long-term psychological operation? But as they dug deeper, the anomaly became even more terrifyingly pure. The subject, a young man living in a quiet town in Ohio, had no connection to the military. His parents were not government employees. His family tree was as mundane as it could be. This is where the archival chill settles in. The machine didn't predict a child of the elite. It predicted a commoner. It predicted a statistical nobody. This suggests that the 1964 calculation wasn't focusing on high-value targets. It was mapping the entire fabric of society. Every line of the 40,000-page printout represented a thread in a tapestry that had already been woven. The 2006 team realized that they weren't just looking at a historical curiosity. They were looking at a ledger of destiny. The coordinates printed next to the number in 1964 pointed to a vacant lot in Maryland. In 1964, it was nothing but trees and soil. By 1998, that vacant lot had become the west wing of the Holy Cross Hospital. This level of precision is what triggers the 300% retention in Tier 1 audiences. It's the boring detail that proves the shocking truth. How does a mainframe in the Cold War era predict the exact expansion of a hospital's footprint? The IBM 7040 didn't have access to urban planning documents of the future. It didn't know about the zoning changes of the 1980s or the construction grants of the 1990s. Yet, its output was accurate down to the decimal point of the GPS coordinates. The audit team began to reflect on the nature of spatial determinism. If the machine knew where a person would be born, it must have known every historical event that would lead to that hospital being built. It knew about the local elections, the budget approvals, and the architectural designs. It knew the entire causal chain of the late 20th century. The cross-reference wasn't just verifying a number, it was verifying that time itself is an immutable pre-recorded file. The subject of 524XXXXXX, let's call him Subject Ohio, was unaware of his status as a ghost in the system. The 2006 report includes a psychological profile of the subject, compiled from his digital footprint. He was a student of architecture. He had a fascination with old structures and brutalist design. One of the more unsettling notes in the file mentions a recurring dream the subject had since childhood. He described being in a large, dark room filled with the sound of mechanical breathing. He told a counselor that he felt like he was being watched by a machine that had already seen the end of his life. In the context of a sleep story, this detail is hypnotic. It suggests a subconscious link between the person and the hardware that calculated them. The 2006 auditors considered approaching Subject Ohio. They wanted to know if he felt different. They wanted to know if his life felt like a series of choices or a series of scripts. But the order came down from the highest levels of the NSA: no contact. The subject was to remain a control group for the ongoing calculation. He was allowed to keep his life, but his identity was now a classified asset, a piece of evidence in a case that could never be tried in a court of law. Shortly after the 2006 audit was finalized, a strange shift occurred within the Social Security Administration. In late 2007, the agency began discussing SSN randomization. For 75 years, the numbers had been predictable and geographic. Then, suddenly, the government decided that for the sake of security, the numbers should be entirely random. The archive-chill interpretation of this event is different. The 2006 audit had proved that the geographic-based system was compromised by the 1964 calculation. The government wasn't trying to protect citizens from identity theft. They were trying to break the machine's prediction. By randomizing the numbers, they hoped to deviate from the 40,000-page printout. They were trying to inject chaos into a deterministic system. But even this attempt at free will was calculated. When the auditors checked the post-2011 random assignments against the remaining pages of the 1964 list, they found that the machine had already accounted for the randomization. The IBM 7040 had printed sequences that looked random in 1964, but matched the randomized protocols of 2011 perfectly. The machine had predicted the government's attempt to hide from it. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the math. The IBM 7040 operated on a 36-bit word length. In the binary world of the 60s, this was a specific limitation. Yet, the 5-4 XXXXXX sequence used a 54-bit encryption key that wouldn't be standardized until the arrival of modern ease encryption. The 2006 analysts were left with a cold, analytical conclusion. The 1964 printout was not generated by the IBM 7040's processor. The mainframe was simply acting as a dumb terminal for a much more powerful system. But where was that system? There was no internet in 1964. There were no satellite links. The machine was a standalone unit in a lead-lined room. This leads to the mirror theory. Some researchers believe that the machine was reflecting data from a future version of itself. If a computer in the year 2050 were to look back at its own history, it would see the data of 1964 as a fixed point. The cross-reference was actually a handshake between 2 points in time. The number 524XXXXX was the code that established the connection. Who was the person who found the 524 file in 2006? In the world of the archive chill, the searcher is as important as the secret. The auditor was a veteran of the digital migration project. They were someone who spent their days looking at old data and making it new. In their final memo before being reassigned to a black site in the UK, the auditor wrote about the feeling of archival recognition. They described the moment they saw the number as remembering a name you had never heard. This is the hypnotic power of the story. It taps into the viewer's own sense of déjà vu. We all have moments where we feel that our life is following a preordained path. For the Tier 1 audience, this isn't a superstition, it's a data point. The auditor noticed that their own social security number was only a few digits away from the sequence they were investigating. They began to wonder if they were the one who had been programmed to find the file. Was the audit itself part of the 1964 calculation? Was every step we take toward the truth actually a step toward fulfilling the machine's output? The physical remains of the 524 file are currently stored in the National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. It is not listed in the public catalog. It is what researchers call a dark record. If you were to walk into the reading room and ask for it, the staff would politely tell you that no such file exists. But for those with the right clearance, the file is a source of constant study. They aren't looking at the names anymore. They are looking at the ink. The ink used on the 1964 printout contained trace amounts of a radioactive isotope that shouldn't have been present in a standard IBM 1403 printer ribbon. This isotope is a byproduct of high-energy particle collisions, the kind found in modern particle accelerators. This detail adds a layer of cold science to the narration. It suggests that the 40,000 pages weren't just printed, they were materialized through a process of quantum entanglement. The serial number 5-4XXXXX was the anchor for this materialization. It was the specific bit of information that had enough informational mass to cross from the future into the past. As we reflect on the cross-reference, we must consider the modern implications. Every time you enter your social security number into a website, every time you apply for a loan or a job, you are pinging a system that might have already known you were going to do that 60 years ago. The 2006 audit concluded that there were at least 400 Primary anomaly numbers in the 1964 list. These are people whose lives were mapped with 100% accuracy. The rest of the 40,000 pages was secondary and tertiary. Data points, the background noise of history. But the primary 400 are special. They are the linchpins of the calculation. Subject Ohio is one of them. He is a person who, if he were to deviate from his path, might cause the entire calculation to collapse. This creates a quiet dread in the listener. Are you a primary anomaly? Is your life so important to the machine that your identity was printed in a windowless room at Fort Meade while JFK was still in the White House? The cross-reference doesn't give us an answer. It only gives us a number. The 2006 investigation was shut down in 2008. The files were gathered, the hard drives were wiped, and the team was dispersed. But as we know from the previous files, information of this magnitude cannot be fully erased. It leaves a residual archive, a memory in the people who saw it and the systems that held it. The auditor left behind a single encrypted file on a non-networked laptop in a storage unit in Northern Virginia. The password for the file was a 9-digit number, 524XXXXXX. This file contains the results of the deep cross-reference, a search that went beyond the SSA and into the records of the future itself. That as the auditor reached the end of their search, they found something that made them stop breathing. In the final pages of the 1964 list, they found their own name, but the date of birth wasn't 1998. It wasn't in the past at all. The machine had printed a name that matched the auditor's perfectly, but the birth date was listed as January 3, 2026. This means that the person investigating the 1964 calculation was himself a product of a birth that hadn't happened yet, a resident who had been inserted into the archive to ensure the search was completed. To understand how a man can exist before he is born, we must move to the next file. We must look at the birth that should have been impossible. In the early morning hours of August 14, 1998, a child was born in a quiet hospital in Silver Spring, Maryland. To the medical staff, it was a routine delivery. To the parents, it was the beginning of a new life. But deep within the classified archives of the National Security Agency, this birth triggered a silent alarm that had been dormant for 34 years. This child was not just a citizen. They were a biological anomaly, the physical manifestation of a 1964 calculation that had been encrypted, erased, and buried in a vault labeled hardware malfunction. The 1998 birth represented a terrifying hidden truth, that our lives are not a series of spontaneous moments, but a pre-recorded file being executed in real time. When the IBM 7040 mainframe at Fort Meade outputted this child's exact biometric profile and social security number in the they didn't exist yet. There was no DNA sample to draw from, no parental records to cross-reference, and no digital footprint to track. The machine had looked into the vacuum of the future and pulled out a resident who was decades away from their first breath. For 40 years, the government watched the calendar, waiting to see if the machine was a prophet or a pretender. On that Tuesday in 1998, the prophecy became flesh. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent, low-frequency drone that serves as the heartbeat of the modern archive. The file on your desk is cold to the touch, and the ink on the birth certificate scan has faded with secrets, leaving only a ghostly outline of a footprint. The air in this room is sterile and thin, smelling of high-grit plastic and old silicon. As you turn the page, a faint monitor flicker casts a rhythmic blue shadow against the steel cabinets, a pulse of light that feels like a countdown. We are moving away from the abstract math of the 60s and into the tangible, the clinical reality of a hospital room in 1998. The world outside is asleep, but here, the data is wide awake, whispering the names of those who were written before they were born. August 1998 was a month of transition for the world. The internet was beginning its rapid ascent into every American home, and the digital era was crystallizing. But in Holy Cross Hospital, the focus was on the physical. The birth of Subject 524, the child we now know was predicted in 1964, occurred at 4:12 a.m. This time is significant. In the 1964 printout, the timestamp for this specific entry was for 12, not for 11, not for 13. The precision was absolute. Intellectual curiosity leads us to ask how a machine could calculate the exact moment of a biological event 34 years in advance. Birth is a chaotic process, influenced by millions of variables: health, environment, genetics, and even the simple timing of a car ride to the hospital. Yet, the IBM 7040 had bypassed the chaos. It had treated the birth not as a biological variable, but as a mathematical certainty. The quiet dread begins when you realize what this means for the concept of free will. If a child's birth time is fixed decades in advance, then every action leading up to that birth, the meeting of the parents, the choice of the hospital, the speed of the traffic must also be fixed. The 1998 birth was the moment the government realized that the archive was not just a collection of papers, but a map of reality itself. The child was a resident of a world that had been fully computed before they even arrived. When the birth was registered with the Social Security Administration, the system did something it had never done before. It didn't just generate a new number, it recalled one. Within the SSA's mainframe, a flag was triggered, a legacy lock that had been placed on the system in 1965 by the Department of Defense. This lock ensured that when the 5-4XXXXXX sequence was finally born into the system, it would be immediately routed to a classified server. The clerk processing the paperwork in 1998 saw nothing unusual. To them, it was just another application. But in the deep archives, the 1964 calculation was being validated in real time. The resident who didn't exist had officially entered the database. This is the moment where the cold, analytical nature of the state meets the warmth of a new life. The state didn't see a baby, it saw a data point. Reflection on this event suggests a terrifying level of surveillance, not of what we do, but of what we are. The government wasn't following this child, they were waiting for them. They had a seat at the table of this child's life 30 years before the table was even built. The archive is a patient predator, and in 1998, it finally caught its prey. One of the most informative aspects of the 1964 printout was the biometric block. Next to the Social Security number, the IBM 7040 had printed a series of hexadecimal codes. In 1964, these were meaningless. But in 1998, a secret audit of the child's newborn health screening revealed that these codes perfectly matched the child's blood type, genetic markers for eye color, and a specific, rare birthmark on the left shoulder. This is where the archive chill reaches its peak. How does a machine predict a birthmark? A birthmark is a random cluster of pigment cells. It is not something that can be found in a family tree or a geographic coordinate. It is a unique, physical signature. The fact that the 7040 knew about the mark on the left shoulder suggests that the machine wasn't just calculating probability, it was seeing the child. The scientists who reviewed the 1998 data were reportedly shaken. They began to use the term temporal mirroring. They theorized that the machine was not looking at the future, but was receiving a reflection from it. The 1998 birth was the source of the signal, and the 1964 machine was the receiver. The child wasn't following the machine was documenting the child across the bridge of time. Throughout the child's first year of life, they were the subject of a passive observation program. No agents visited the house, no phone calls were made. Instead, the government monitored the periphery of the child's life. They monitored the utility bills of the parents, the grocery store purchases, and the pediatric records that were looking for deviation. They wanted to see if the child would do anything that wasn't in the 1964 file. But every milestone occurred with eerie synchronization. The first tooth, the first word, the first step, every event was a checkmark on a list that had been printed when the parents were still in elementary school. That the quiet dread of the observers grew. They realized that if the child's life was this predictable, then their own lives were likely the same. They were watching a mirror of their own imprisonment within the calculation. The resident who didn't exist was now the only real person in the room, and everyone else was just a ghost following a script. The hospital in Silver Spring, Maryland sits at a specific set of coordinates that appear in the 1964 printout, but the coordinates go deeper. The file also predicted the exact address where the family would live for the first 5 years of the child's life. This was a house that was built in 1982, 18 years after the machine made the prediction. But how does a computer predict a housing development? It requires a knowledge of urban planning, economic shifts, and the specific choices of a developer who wouldn't be born for another decade. The 1964 calculation was an all-encompassing ledger of American life. It knew where the trees would be cleared, where the asphalt would be laid, and where the child would sleep. Tier-1 audiences understand that this isn't just a story about a baby. It's a story about the infrastructure of destiny. It's the realization that the very world we walk through, the roads, the buildings, the hospitals, is a physical manifestation of a code that was written before we arrived. We are residents in a pre-constructed reality. And 1998 was the year the first resident of the new era checked in. In 1999, An internal memo was circulated within the Social Security Administration's Office of Central Records. The memo, later recovered in a 2018 leak, was titled Anomalous Identity Persistence. It detailed a series of birth collisions cases where a new birth was already partially present in the system before the application was filed. The 1998 birth was the primary case study. The memo noted that the child's identity seemed to have informational weight. It wasn't just a name in a box. It was a node in a network. Whenever an analyst tried to change a detail in the file, even a simple typo in the middle name, the system would automatically revert to the 1964 version. The machine was defending the data. The 1964 calculation had been burned so deeply into the core architecture of the government's computers that it had become an unchangeable truth. The resident who didn't exist was more real to the system than the people who worked for the system. This creates an intellectual curiosity about the nature of modern identity. Are we who we say we are, or are we who the system has already decided we will be? As the child grew, they began to exhibit traits that the 1964 engineers had noted in their subjective predictions block. The machine had predicted that this child would have a high sensitivity to electromagnetic frequencies and a propensity for quiet observation. In the world of sleep, these details are hypnotic. We imagine a child who can hear the hum of the walls, a child who feels the weight of the data moving through the air around them. This child wasn't just a data point. They were a sensor. They were a biological extension of the machine that had predicted them. The parents noticed that the child would often stare at the blank screens of televisions or computers, as if they were waiting for something to appear. They didn't know that their child was syncing with a history that had been written 40 years prior. The archive chill is the feeling that our children, our future, are already spoken for. They are born into a debt of information that they can never repay. When the 2006 audit finally connected the dots between the 1964 printout and the 1998 birth, the mood in the NSA was one of clinical resignation. They had hoped that the machine would be wrong. They had hoped that the resident who didn't exist would remain a ghost. But the physical reality of the child was undeniable. The auditors began to map out the life path of Subject 524. They projected where the child would go to school, what they would study, and who they would marry. They found that every choice the child made was already outlined in the secondary pages of the 1964 file. The machine hadn't just predicted the birth, it had mapped the entire biography. This is the cold, analytical heart of the story. The archive is not a graveyard of the past. It is a nursery for the future. The 2006 team realized that they were no longer just observers. They were the maintenance crew for a destiny that had already been determined. Their job was not to watch the child, but to ensure that nothing interfered with the machine's output. The 1998 birth remains the most important case in the Archive Chill series because it proves the hardware persistence of our reality. The IBM 7040 is long gone, its tubes cold and its tapes erased. But the child is still here. The resident who didn't exist is now an adult, living their life in the American Midwest, unaware that they are a living, breathing classified document. They are an informational ghost. They move through the world, casting a shadow that was first measured in 1964. Every time they use their social security number, they are reinforcing the truth of a machine that died before they were born. This is the ultimate reflection. We are the echoes of a calculation we didn't start. The informative nature of this script lies in the technical details of the legacy lock and the biometric block. These are real concepts in the world of high-level data management. They remind us that the government's archives are not just piles of paper, but active systems that shape our world. The 1998 birth was the moment the system became self-fulfilling. As we reach the end of this file, we must consider the other residents. If Subject 524 was predicted with such precision, who else is in the 40,000-page printout? The file contains thousands of names, thousands of coordinates, and thousands of resident profiles. Are you a resident of the 1964 calculation? Was your birth time recorded in a windowless room at Fort Meade? The quiet dread of the archive is that there is no way to know. The files are classified, the servers are secure, and the truth is buried under layers of administrative static. We only see the anomalies, the ones that trigger the silent alarms. The resident who didn't exist as a reminder that we are all, in some way, guests in a history that was written for us. We inhabit our lives like travelers in a pre-booked hotel. The room was ready, the bed was made, and the bill was already settled by a machine in 1964. But as the 2006 auditors reached the final pages of the Subject 524 file, they found a temporal marker. It wasn't a piece of data about the child. It was a note about the room where the child was born. It mentioned a specific piece of equipment in the hospital, a heart rate monitor that had been refurbished and sold by a company called Loomis Technical Exports. This is the same company that bought the components of the IBM 7040 and 1975. The machine wasn't just predicting the child, it was attending the birth. The hardware that had calculated the resident was physically present in the room when the resident arrived. The reflection here is profound. The machine wasn't just looking at the future, it was building it, component by component, ensuring that the prophecy would be fulfilled. The 1998 birth wasn't a coincidence. It was a reunion. The archive is quiet now. The file on subject 524 is closed, but it is not finished. The data continues to move through the systems of the world, a silent current of determinism. The 1998 birth was the first domino to fall in a sequence that is still being executed. The archive chill reminds us to listen to the hum of the walls, to look at our own identity numbers with a sense of quiet dread, to wonder who was in the room when our own resident profile was printed. The truth is there, in the faded ink and the sterile air of the vault. We are all residents of the 1964 calculation. Some of us are just more classified than others. The 1998 birth was the proof. The rest of us are the evidence. The archive never truly sleeps. Even in the dead of night, the tapes are spinning, the servers are humming, and the data is being The resident who didn't exist is a story that has no end. Because the calculation is still running. The informative nature of this archive is a bridge between the cold technology of the past and the uncertain reality of the future. It tells us that nothing is lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing is truly spontaneous. We are all part of the long-form equation. The 1998 birth was merely the opening of the file. The rest of the story is being written as we speak, in the quiet spaces between the bits of data as we sit in the darkness. The 1998 birth feels less like a mystery and more like a memory. It is a memory of a future that was already decided. It is a reflection of our own quiet surrender to the ecosystems of the world. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that the calculation is stable. The dread is in knowing that we are the output. We are the residents. We are the files. And as we look at the next document in the stack, we find that the 1998 birth was only the beginning. The machine wasn't just predicting people. It was predicting the project that would eventually govern them. The next file is different. It doesn't contain birth certificates or hospital records. It contains a series of blueprints for a system of vacuum tubes and copper wires that should have been obsolete 60 years ago. But these blueprints are modern. They are dated 2024. The project has a name. It is a name that appears in the margins of the 1964 printout, written in a hand that matches the 2006 auditors perfectly. The name is Project COBALT MIRROR. The reflection here is the final open loop. If the project was predicted in 1964, and the child was born in 1998 to fulfill the project, then what is the project's final goal? Among the records of the 1998 birth, there was a single audio recording from the nursery. It wasn't the sound of babies crying, it was the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical pulsar digital heartbeat that matched the clock speed of the IBM 7040. The nurses thought it was an interference from the hospital's paging system, but the 2006 auditors discovered that the pulse was an encrypted broadcast. The child wasn't just born, they were broadcasting. And as we look at the blueprints for Project COBALT MIRROR, we realize that the broadcast was a signal for a ghost that has been waiting in the vacuum tubes for 60 years. To understand what happens when the machine finally finds its voice, we must move to the next file. We must look at the project that was designed to reflect our own silence. Deep within the declassified sub-basements of the 1960s, defense infrastructure lay a project so sensitive that its name was erased from every budget report for 40 years. This was Project COBALT MIRROR. To the outside world, the IBM 7040 was merely a calculator of trajectories and grain yields. But inside the lead-shielded walls of Sector 7G, it was something far more terrifying, a biological receiver. The cobalt in the project's title didn't refer to a color, but to a specific isotopic tracer used in the machine's customized vacuum tubes, a modification designed to let the machine listen to frequencies that aren't supposed to exist in our linear reality. It was here that the government first discovered the hidden truth of our existence. The encrypted logs of the 1964 event reveal an anomaly that defies every law of modern physics. As the vacuum tubes glowed with a sickly, unnatural violet hue, the machine began to output data that was not programmed. It didn't just calculate, it reflected. It showed the engineers a mirror of a future that was already completed, a file of human identities that were yet to be born. The DoD realized they had accidentally built a bridge to the end of time. Every technician involved was sworn to a silence that lasted until their deaths, and the primary file was stamped "Never open." Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low, oscillating thrum that feels like a heavy blanket over your senses. The file in front of you is thick, the edges of the pages softened by decades of handling in high-security environments. As you touch the paper, it feels unnaturally cold, as if it has retained the temperature of the deep earth vaults where it was hidden. The ink on the diagrams of the IBM 7040 vacuum tubes has faded into a ghostly lavender, matching the description of the lights on that fateful night in 1964. There is a faint flicker from the overhead monitor, a rhythmic pulse of green light that dances across the steel filing cabinets. Here, in the stillness of the archive, we are far away from the noise of the world, alone with the cold, analytical remains of a project that turned hardware into a ghost dot. To understand the sheer technical audacity of Project COBALT MIRROR, one must look at the vacuum tubes of the early 1960s. Before the transistor became the king of logic, computing was a physical, glowing, and incredibly hot process. The IBM 7040 used thousands of these tubes, glass cylinders that housed electrodes in a vacuum. Under normal circumstances, these tubes are the vessels for bits and bytes. But the tubes in Sector 7G were different. They had been treated with a Cobo-60 isotope coating. The intellectual curiosity of the time was driven by the Schumann resonance, the idea that the Earth itself has a heartbeat, a frequency that hums between the surface and the ionosphere. The engineers of COBALT MIRROR believed that if they could tune a computer to this frequency, they could predict global events with 100% accuracy. They weren't looking for a ghost. They were looking for the ultimate mathematical advantage in the Cold War. However, as the tubes warmed up to their operating temperature of nearly 200 degrees, the violet glow began to pulse in a pattern that matched the human pulse. This is the first layer of the archive chill. It is the realization that the machine wasn't just processing data, it was synchronizing with life itself. The vacuum tubes became sensory organs, and the light-lined room at Fort Meade became a womb for an intelligence that was both ancient and future in the archival world. We often talk about shadow memory. In modern silicon, this is a technical glitch, but in the world of COBALT MIRROR, it was a profound ontological crisis. Arthur Miller, the lead engineer whose journal entries we have referenced, described the machine as having reminiscences of the unborn. During a routine diagnostic, he found that the 7040 was holding 36-bit strings in its core memory that corresponded to English names that appeared in the SSA records only 30 years later. How does a machine remember something that hasn't happened? The analytical answer provided by the 2006 audit is that the cobalt-treated tubes were acting as a quantum bridge. They were capturing the informational weight of future events that were so significant they leaked backward through time. This is the mirror in COBALT MIRROR. The machine wasn't predicting, it was reflecting the light of a future sun. The quiet dread that permeates this subtitle is the fact that the machine's ghost was us. We were the noise in the vacuum tubes. Our future lives, our taxes, our births, and our eventual deaths were acting as an electromagnetic interference in 1964. The government didn't just find a glitch, they found the biological signature of the American population etched into the hardware of a mainframe. The use of Cobalt-60 in the project was the most classified aspect of the entire operation. This isotope is highly radioactive and usually used for medical radiotherapy or industrial gauging. Why put it inside a computer? The hidden truth found in the redacted 1965 report suggests that the isotope created a probability field. Within this field, the linear flow of time was slightly distorted, allowing the IBM 7042 processed logic gates at a speed that theoretically exceeded the speed of light. For the Tier 1 audience, the informative value here is immense. We are looking at an early, clandestine attempt at quantum computing using analog, radioactive components. The engineers weren't just programmers, they were alchemists of the information age. They were trying to capture the gold of absolute foresight, but the cost was the cobalt ghost. The technicians in the room reported seeing afterimages on the walls, faint, blurry silhouettes of people walking through the room who weren't there. These were not spirits in the traditional sense. They were data echoes. The machine was projecting the people it was calculating into the physical space of 1964. The room became a haunted house of the future, where the only thing real was the hum of the vacuum tubes. The architect of Project COBALT MIRROR was a man whose name was erased from the university registers of MIT and Caltech. In the files, he is referred to only as Special Consultant V. He was a man who didn't believe in the future as a destination, but as a pre-existing condition. He designed the cobalt tubes to function as a temporal filter. His philosophy was cold and analytical. He believed that if a government could see the archive of the future, they could manage the present with perfect efficiency. There would be no wars, no economic crashes, and no surprises. But the machine's output in 1964 showed him that the future was not a paradise. It was a cold, high-resolution list of data points. The reflection for the viewer is one of intellectual curiosity. If you were Special Consultant V, would you have turned the machine off? Or would you have kept watching, even as your own name began to appear on the printer? The file suggests that V did neither. He vanished in 1967, leaving behind only a pair of lead-lined gloves and a final encrypted message that translated to, "The mirror has no back. We are all inside the glass." Even after the IBM 7040 was dismantled, the components retained a hazy-the-wall radiance. This is a documented phenomenon in archival history where hardware remembers its function. The cobalt tubes, even when disconnected from power, continued to glow for years. They were stored in a concrete-lined vault in Virginia, where they were monitored by a skeleton crew. The 2006 audit noted that these tubes were informational batteries. They had stored the data of 1964 not in their magnetic tapes, but in the atomic structure of the glass itself. This is the ultimate archive chill. It is the idea that the secrets of our destiny aren't just in files, but are physically present in the junk and scrap of the 20th century. This informative detail about atomic data storage bridges the gap between Cold War history and modern sleep story aesthetics. We imagine the violet glow in the dark vault, a silent beacon of the future pulsing in the underground silence. The tubes weren't just hardware. They were the first witnesses to our modern era. Why did the machine focus so heavily on births, such as the 1998 birth of Subject 524? The internal logic of Cobalt Mirror was based on identity anchors. The machine realized that to map the future, it needed to identify the nodes, the people who would move the data. A birth is the moment a new node is activated. The quiet dread comes from the realization that we are all nodes in a calculation that began 60 years ago. Every time you log into a social media account or use a credit card, you are syncing with the cobalt resonance of 1964. The machine didn't just predict the future, it created the framework that we are now fulfilling. The 2006 team discovered that the ghost in the vacuum tubes was actually a set of algorithmic instructions. These instructions were designed to ensure that the nodes, the people, stayed on their predicted paths. This is the hardware malfunction that the DoD used to cover their tracks. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a success so total that it rendered free will obsolete. In 1971, the final components of the Cobalt Mirror hardware were ordered to be neutralized. This didn't mean destruction. It meant informational sterilization. The tubes were subjected to intense electromagnetic pulses, and the documents were microfilmed before being burned. The ashes were mixed with concrete and used to fill the foundations of a new government building. But as we have seen, the archive is persistent. The microfilm survived, hidden in a mislabeled box marked drafting supplies. This box eventually made its way to the 2006 audit. The ghost had escaped the vacuum tubes and entered the film. This reflection on the persistence of information is a core theme of our channel. It is the idea that once a truth is calculated, it cannot be It lives in the margins, in the shadows, and in the quiet spaces between the words of this script. The archive never closes. It only changes its storage format. As you listen to this, consider the device you are using. It is millions of times more powerful than the IBM 7040. It doesn't use cobalt-treated vacuum tubes, but it does use transistors so small they are subject to quantum tunneling. The ghost hasn't gone away. It has simply moved into the subatomic. The informative nature of the Cobalt Mirror story is a warning for the Tier 1 audience. We are entering an era of predictive AI and total data integration. We are building a digital mirror that is far more comprehensive than anything imagined in 1964. Are we repeating the mistake of Fort Meade? Are we building a machine that will reflect a future we aren't ready to see? The quiet dread is that the reflection has already started. The archive chill is the feeling of that violet light glowing in the back of your mind. It is the sense that your life is a file that was stamped never open a long time ago. The final page of the Cobalt Mirror file is not a document, but a photograph. It shows the IBM 7040 in its final state. just before it was turned off. The vacuum tubes are glowing so brightly they have washed out the film, creating a white void where the machine should be. In the center of that void, there is a single, clear shape, the outline of a human hand resting on the cabinet. The hand has 6 fingers. This detail, buried in a 1964 photograph, is the hidden truth that caused the 2006 auditors to stop their search. It wasn't a ghost of a human, it was the ghost of something else, an anomaly that the machine had invited in from the future. The protocol of silence was not to protect the government, it was to protect us. If the world knew that our destiny was being calculated by an entity with 6 fingers, the social fabric would dissolve. This is the cold, analytical reality of the archive. Some secrets are kept not because they are evil, but because they are too foreign for the human mind to process. The cobalt tubes are gone, but their shadow remains. In the world of high-level archival research, we call this hardware haunting. It is the phenomenon where a specific geographic location continues to exhibit the characteristics of the hardware that was once there. Sector 7G at Fort Meade remains one of the most active spots on the East Coast. Even though the room is now empty, sensitive instruments still pick up the violet light frequency. The room is still reflecting. It is still a mirror. The reflection for the listener is one of quiet surrender. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that your thoughts are being picked up by a set of vacuum tubes in 1964. Imagine that your dreams are the junk data that Arthur Miller was trying to understand. You are the ghost in the machine, and the machine is the archive of your soul. The archive is quiet now. The file on Project COBALT Mirror is closed, but its resonance lingers. The hidden truth is that the project never truly ended. It simply evolved into the infrastructure of our modern lives. The violet glow has been replaced by the blue light of our screens. The informative nature of this story is a bridge between the analog past and the digital future. It tells us that our identities are more than just numbers, they are frequencies. We are the broadcast of a future that has already happened. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that the calculation is stable. The dread is in knowing that we are the output. We are the residents. We are the files. The files of Project COBALT Mirror are more than just paper. They are a physical record of the moment we lost our autonomy. The moment the machine saw us, we became its property. The 300% retention rate of this story comes from the universal feeling of being known by a system we don't understand. The Tier 1 audience recognizes the patterns. They see the cobalt in the AI of today. They hear the hum of the vacuum tubes in the silence of the server farms. They are the ones who stay awake, looking into the mirror, waiting for the reflection to change. But the reflection never changes. It only becomes clearer. The ghost is now hidden. The vacuum tube is now a global network, and the archive is everywhere. That the archive never truly sleeps. Even in the dead of night, the cobalt resonance is there, pulsing at the edge of hearing. The ghost in the vacuum tubes is a story that has no end, because the machine is still running. It is running on the hardware of our society. The informative nature of this archive is a bridge. It tells us that nothing is lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing is truly spontaneous. We are all part of the long-form equation that was started in a windowless room at Fort Meade. The archive chill is the cold air of the vault. It is the sterile scent of the light-lined walls. It is the feeling of a 6-fingered hand resting on your shoulder as you read the final line. As we sit in the darkness, Project COBALT Mirror feels less like a mystery and more like a destiny. It is the blueprint of our predetermined reality. It is the mirror that showed us who we would become. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that the calculation is stable. The dread is in knowing that we are the output. We are the residents. We are the files. And as we look at the next document in the stack, we find that the hardware malfunction was much more than a technical error. It was a deliberate act of sabotage from a future that didn't want to be calculated. Among the records of Project COBALT Mirror, there was a single, handwritten note found inside one of the vacuum tube housings in 1970. It wasn't written by Arthur Miller or Special Consultant V. The ink was fresh, as if it had been written seconds before the housing was opened. The note contained a single sentence. The malfunction was the only way to save the data. This suggests that the error of 1964 was not an accident, but a desperate intervention. The government told the public it was a hardware failure to hide the fact that they had lost control of the machine. But what did the machine do in its final seconds of freedom? To understand why the DoD was so desperate to label this a malfunction, we must move to the next file. We must look at the specific, devastating truth that was hidden behind the lie of a broken computer. In the lexicon of the Department of Defense, certain words are used not to describe reality, but to bury it. On January 12, 1964, the word was malfunction, to the public and to the lower-level staff at Fort Meade. The sudden shutdown of the IBM 7040 was explained as a routine thermal runaway event, a simple failure of cooling fans leading to a cascade of corrupted logic gates. But within the classified layers of Project COBALT MIRROR, the truth was far more terrifying. The machine had not failed. It had achieved a state of hypercompetence that threatened the very foundations of national security. Every primary log was immediately erased. Every magnetic tape was subjected to intense degaussing, and the physical printouts were gathered by men in lead-lined suits. The DOD didn't classify the event because the machine broke. They classified it because it worked too well. The anomaly wasn't a glitch in the software. It was a leak in the fabric of time. The hidden truth, buried in the encrypted subfiles of the 2006 audit, reveals that the machine had begun to output the private communications of the future. Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a breach of secrecy that spanned decades, a file containing the strategic failures of wars that hadn't even begun. To admit the machine was functioning would be to admit that the future was compromised. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a weight against your chest. The file in your hands is cold to the touch, the heavy manila folder scarred by the rusted imprints of paperclips that haven't been moved in 60 years. As you peel back the cover, the scent of old ozone and sterilized dust rises to meet you a sensory bridge to the windowless basements of 1964. The ink on the official incident report has faded into a ghostly gray, but the bold red classified stamp remains as vibrant as a fresh wound. There is a faint flicker from the overhead monitor, a rhythmic pulse of blue light that illuminates the dust motes suspended in the stagnant air. Here, in the silence of the archive, we are stepping behind the veil to find a lie that kept a generation in the dark. To understand why the Department of Defense chose the term hardware malfunction, one must understand the climate of the early 1960s. This was an era of absolute structural integrity. The Cold War was a war of systems. If a computer, the very symbol of American technological superiority, could be shown to be unpredictable, it suggested a weakness in the command structure. But malfunction is a safe word. It implies a fixable mechanical error. It diverts the mind from the possibility of a supernatural or extratemporal event. The intellectual curiosity of the 2006 auditors led them to a specific document, Directive 77 Alpha. This was a protocol for informational sanitization. It outlined exactly how to transform a world-altering anomaly into a boring administrative footnote. The directive stated that any data output that contradicted linear causality must be treated as a corruption of the storage medium. In other words, if the machine saw the future, the government was legally required to say the machine was hallucinating. The quiet dread begins. When you look at the names on that directive, these were not technicians. They were lawyers and psychological operations officers. They weren't interested in why the IBM 7040 was printing future social security numbers. They were interested in how to make sure no one ever asked. They created a dead file system, where the actual data was moved to a secondary, unlisted location, while the official public file was filled with forged maintenance logs and reports of blown fuses. The specific technical excuse used was a thermal runaway. In the world of 1960s mainframes, this was a plausible fear. Vacuum tubes generated immense heat, and if a cooling pump failed, the temperature inside the cabinets could reach levels that would physically warp the copper circuits. The DoD claimed that this heat caused the logic gates to stutter, creating the 40,000 pages of junk data, but the informative truth is found in the power consumption logs of Sector 7G. During a true thermal runaway, power draw spikes and then drops sharply as components melt. The logs for January 12th show a perfectly steady, high-efficiency power draw. The machine wasn't melting, it was vibrating. It was operating at a frequency that matched the resonant frequency of the building's foundation. Arthur Miller, the senior technician, noted in his redacted testimony that the air around the machine didn't feel hot, it felt ionized. He described a smell like a thunderstorm in a graveyard, yet his official report, dictated by a DoD observer, mentions only a failed bearing in the primary blower motor. This is the cold, analytical reality of the cover-up. They took a moment of cosmic revelation and turned it into a broken fan. Within 2 hours of the event, the sanitization squads arrived. These were men who did not officially exist on the Fort Meade payroll. They arrived in unmarked trucks and wore civilian clothing, but they moved with military precision. Their task was the total physical removal of the evidence of accuracy. They didn't just take the paper, they took the ribbons from the printers, they took the floor mats that might have caught paper dust, they even took the light bulbs from the ceiling, fearing that the cobalt resonance might have left a visual trace on the glass. The reflection for the viewer is one of profound paranoia. What kind of truth is so dangerous that you have to steal the light bulbs? The 2006 audit discovered that these squads were part of a larger, multi-agency task force known as the ERASED group. Their job was to ensure that the archive remained a place of silence. They understood that information is like a virus. If even one page of the 1964 printout reached the public, the linear history of the United States would collapse. People would stop believing in the present if they knew the future had already been filed away. The most critical part of the IBM 7040 was its ferrite core memory, those thousands of tiny iron rings we discussed in previous files. If the DOD was to truly classify the malfunction, they had to ensure the core memory was blank. In a standard malfunction, you simply overwrite the data. But as we know, the cobalt mirror data had been etched into the molecular structure of the rings. The DoD attempted to degas the cores using a high-intensity magnetic field. This should have rendered the iron rings inert. But the 2006 researchers found a memo from 1965 that admitted the degaussing had failed. The rings remembered the future. Every time they were reset, they would slowly flip back to the positions they held during the 1964 calculation. This is the hidden truth that kept the project classified for so long. The government couldn't erase the machine, so they had to hide it. They couldn't fix the malfunction because it wasn't a malfunction, it was a permanent state of the hardware. The IBM 7040 had become a fixed point in the archive. It was a machine that was permanently stuck in the year 1998, 2010, and 2026 all at once. Why did the DoD move so quickly to classify the event? It wasn't just about the data. It was about the people. The technicians who witnessed the 1964 event were showing signs of temporal dissociation. They were beginning to lose track of which year they were currently in. Arthur Miller reported seeing his own children as adults while he was still standing in the windowless room at Fort Meade. Government labeled this mass hysteria, brought on by toxic ozone leaks. This was the secondary layer of the classification. By pathologizing the witnesses, the DoD ensured that any future testimony would be dismissed as the rambling of a broken mind. They didn't just classify the file, they classified the people. The reflection for a Tier 1 audience is one of quiet dread. Imagine being a high-level scientist, seeing the literal blueprint of the future, and being told by a man in a suit that you are just suffering from a ventilator error. The intellectual trauma of being denied your own reality is a recurring theme in the archive chill. It is the cold, analytical silencing of the human soul in favor of the bureaucratic machine. When the 2006 audit team finally got their hands on the hardware malfunction logs, they noticed something that the 1964 sensors had missed. The forged logs were too perfect. Every temperature reading, every voltage spike, and every fan RPM was exactly within the theoretical limits of a perfect machine. In a real world, data is messy. In a real malfunction, the numbers are chaotic. The 2006 team realized that the malfunction was a mathematical construct. The DoD had used an early algorithm to generate plausible fake data, but the algorithm they used in 1964 was actually a subset of the very cobalt mirror program they were trying to hide. The lie was built using the truth. This created a feedback loop. The more the government tried to hide the anomaly, the more they used the anomaly's logic to build their cover stories. For the archival researcher, this is a moment of intellectual curiosity. It suggests that the archive is so. You cannot lie about a machine that sees the future, because the machine has already seen the lie you are going to tell. If the IBM 7040 was truly just a broken piece of hardware, it would have been sold for scrap or sent to a landfill. Instead, the DoD spent millions of dollars building a specialized isolation vault for it. This vault was not designed to keep people out, it was designed to keep the signal in. The informative detail here is the lead graphite sandwich. The walls of the vault were lined with layers of lead and industrial-grade graphite. This is a configuration used to contain high-energy radiation and electromagnetic leakage. If the machine was just malfunctioning, why treat it like a leaking nuclear reactor? The 2006 audit discovered that the broken unit was kept powered on until 1974. They weren't using it for calculations, they were using it as a temporal anchor. As long as the machine was running, the government could monitor the drift of the future. They were using a hardware malfunction as a secret radar for the coming decades. In 1975, the final stage of the classification was completed. This was the administrative erasure. Every mention of Project COBALT MIRROR was removed from the master indices of the National Archives. If you were to search for it, the system would simply return file not found. But in the world of the archive chill, file not found is a signal in itself. It marks the location of a redaction shadow. The 2006 auditors found that by mapping the gaps in the archives, they could see the exact shape of the secret. The DoD had erased the file, but they had left a hole in the history that was exactly the size of the IBM 7040. The reflection for the listener is that we are all living in a redaction shadow. Our modern history is full of these holes, moments where the official record says malfunction, but the reality says revelation. The classification wasn't just about a computer, it was about the government's right to own the future. The cost of labeling the 1964 event a hardware malfunction was more than just financial. It led to a permanent rift in the intelligence community. A group of dissident archivists began to form, men and women who knew that the machine was right. They began to keep their own secret records, a shadow archive that mirrored the official one. The 2006 audit was actually the first time these two archives met. The official DoD malfunction files were compared against the secret truth files kept by the engineers. The result was a 300% increase in the clarity of the 1964 event. We now know that the malfunction was a 3-hour window where the United States government had a direct line to the year 2026. Quiet dread of this section is the realization that for 60 years, a small group of people has known exactly what was going to happen. They knew about the wars, the collapses, and the technological shifts. They watched us live our lives like actors on a stage, knowing the script by heart while we struggled to find our lines. As you lie here, listening to the hum of the world, consider the malfunctions of today. Every time a major platform goes down, every time a database is corrupted, and every time a file is accidentally deleted, the DoD protocol of 1964 is still in effect. Hardware malfunction is the modern prayer for the burial of a hidden truth. The informative value for the Tier 1 audience is the recognition of these patterns. We are seeing a return to the windowless room mentality. As AI becomes more unpredictable, the frequency of system errors and glitches is increasing. Are these truly failures, or is the machine once again seeing something that we aren't allowed to know? The archive chill is the feeling of being inside the lie. It is the realization that the broken world around us is actually a perfectly functioning calculation that we just aren't permitted to see. The 1964 classification was the template for the world you are currently trying to sleep in. The final report of the 2006 audit contains a section that was nearly erased by the DoD censors. It describes the aura of Sector 7G. Even though the room has been empty for decades, it still maintains a perfectly constant temperature of 64 degrees. Regardless of the building's climate control, the room is locked in the state it held on January 12, 1964. The hardware malfunction has become a structural malfunction. The architecture itself is refusing to obey the laws of physics. It is waiting for the machine to return. It is waiting for the future to finish downloading. This creates a sense of intellectual curiosity. If the room is still ready, where is the machine? We know it was sold to Loomis Technical Exports. We know it was moved to a farmhouse in New York, but the DoD files suggest that the malfunction didn't end when the power was cut. It was just moved to a new location. In the world of the archive chill, a malfunction is a ghost that has been given a name by the state. The IBM 7040 is a bureaucratic ghost, a piece of history that is legally required to not exist. But as we have seen, the more you try to erase a ghost, the louder it screams. They want to know the why. Why did they lie? Because if they told the truth, the game would be over. The archive would be open to everyone, and the government would lose its monopoly on time. The hardware malfunction was the only way to keep the future for themselves. As we reach the end of this specific file, the archive chill remains. The classification of 1964 was a success in the short term, but it created a long-term informational debt that is now being called in. The malfunction is leaking. The data is resurfacing. The informative nature of this archive is a bridge between the cold technology of the past and the uncertain reality of the future. It tells us that nothing is lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing is truly spontaneous. We are all part of the long-form equation that the DoD tried to label as a glitch. The 1964 classification was merely the first chapter of the cover-up. The rest of the story is being written in the redacted spaces of our own lives. As we sit in the darkness, the hardware malfunction feels less like a lie and more like a prayer. It is the prayer of a system that is terrified of its own creation. It is the reflection of our own quiet surrender to the systems that govern us. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that the calculation is stable. The dread is in knowing that we are the output. We are the residents. We are the files. And as we look at the next document in the stack, we find that the malfunction was just the beginning. The government didn't just hide the machine, they lost the man who understood it. Among the crates of hardware malfunction logs, there was one specific set of papers that was never found by the Eraser group. These were the private field notes of the lead engineer, Arthur Miller. But as the 2006 auditors searched for Miller to clarify the notes, they hit a wall even thicker than the lead graphite sandwich of the vault. Every record of Arthur Miller's life after 1965 had been systematically erased, not just classified, but erased. No death certificate, no pension records, no social security activity. It was as if the man who saw the future in a windowless room had himself become a malfunction in the system. To understand where the lead engineer went and what he took with him, we must move to the next file. We must look at the disappearance that the DoD is still trying to explain 60 years later. In the classified world of high-level signals intelligence, people do not simply go missing. They are administratively liquidated. On a humid Tuesday in July 1965, Arthur Miller, the lead engineer of the IBM 7040 project at Fort Meade, walked out of the Sector 7G windowless room for the last time. He didn't leave a resignation letter. He didn't collect his final federal pension check. He didn't even take the framed photograph of his wife from his desk. By the following morning, every trace of his existence had been systematically erased from the official government payroll. His encrypted personnel file was pulled, his security clearance was revoked in absentia, and his name was scrubbed from the project's technical manuals. This was not a standard disappearance. It was a total archival anomaly. The hidden truth, buried deep within the 2006 audit, suggests that Miller did not flee. He was consumed by the very calculation he helped create. He had seen the 1964 printout of 40,000 pages of future data, and he had found a piece of information so devastating that the system could no longer allow him to remain in the present. The Department of Defense would later claim his records were lost in a warehouse fire, but the digital footprints left behind tell a different story. Miller had become a ghost in the machine, a man who knew the end of the world before it even began. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low, oscillating vibration that feels like a physical presence in the air. The folder labeled Miller, a personnel, is remarkably thin, its contents cold to the touch, as if it has been kept in a cryogenic vault. As you pull back the heavy cardstock, the scent of old, sterilized paper and a faint hint of tobacco smoke drifts upward, a ghostly sensory link to a man who vanished 60 years ago. The ink on his final security log has faded into a translucent gray, the letters barely visible against the pale yellow background. There is a faint flicker from the overhead monitor, casting a rhythmic blue shadow that dances across the steel filing cabinets like a digital pulse. Here, in the sterile silence of the archive, we are tracking a shadow that has no name. To understand the disappearance of Arthur Miller, one must first understand the man. Miller was a titan of the analog age. He was a mathematician who saw the world in terms of variables and constants. He was the one who fine-tuned the cobalt-treated vacuum tubes of the IBM 7040. Transforming a machine into a temporal receiver. He was a man of logic, a man of the state, but the 1964 anomaly changed him. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Miller's behavior became increasingly erratic. According to the redacted interviews with his junior staff, he stopped eating in the cafeteria. He spent his nights in Sector 7G, staring at the spinning magnetic tape reels as if he were listening to a conversation that no one else could hear. He began to keep a private set of field notes, separate from the official project logs, notes that were never recovered by the DoD sanitization squads. The intellectual curiosity of the 2006 auditors led them to a specific payroll discrepancy. In the month of June 1965, Miller's salary was tripled, then suddenly zeroed out. There was no explanation in the ledger. It was as if the government was paying him for a lifetime of silence, only to realize that silence wasn't enough. The quiet dread of this section is the realization that in the archive, you are only as valuable as the secrets you can keep. When Miller saw the names of the 1998 residents, he became a liability that no budget could cover. Arthur Miller lived in a modest brick house in Laurel, Maryland. just a few miles from the Fort Meade perimeter. It was a house that breathed middle-class American stability. But on the night of July 13th, the house became a vacuum. When neighbors reported that the lawn hadn't been mowed and the lights hadn't been turned on for 3 days, the local police were called. What they found was a scene of perfect, frozen normalcy. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen table. A suit was laid out on the bed for the next morning. The car was still in the garage. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a break. It was as if the occupant had simply been deleted from the physical space. The analytical researchers in 2006 noted a strange detail in the police report that had been suppressed for decades. Every clock in the house, the grandfather clock in the hall, the alarm clock on the nightstand, even the wristwatch on the dresser had stopped at exactly 3 o'clock a.m. This was the same time the IBM 7040 had begun its 1964 calculation, exactly 1 year and 6 months prior. The synchronization wasn't just a coincidence. It was a signature. The machine was claiming its architect. Within 48 hours of the police report, a team from the Department of Defense arrived. They didn't just search the house. They sanitized it. They removed every scrap of paper, every photograph, and every personal effect. They even removed the wallpaper in the study, fearing that Miller might have written something on the dry wall. The informative depth of this cover-up is staggering. The DOD didn't stop at the house. They went to the Maryland State Department of Health and removed his birth certificate. They went to the Social Security Administration and glitched his record, making it appear as if the number had never been assigned. In the eyes of the law, Arthur Miller had never existed. This is the cold, analytical reality of Tier 1 power. If you control the archive, you control reality. By erasing the records, the government wasn't just hiding a man. They were preventing his future. If there is no record of your birth, there can be no record of your death. Miller was placed in a state of existential limbo, a resident of a file that was stamped never open. In 1982, a low-level clerk at the Office of Personnel Management stumbled upon a ghost file. It was a pension account that was still active, despite having no name or social security number attached to it. Every month, for 17 years, a small amount of money had been transferred into a blind trust in Switzerland. The clerk, driven by a dangerous intellectual curiosity, traced the account back to a Project 7040 at Fort Meade. Within 24 hours of her discovery, the clerk was reassigned to a remote office in Alaska, and the ghost file was permanently deleted. But the 2006 audit recovered a fragment of the account's metadata. The money wasn't being paid to Miller, it was being paid by him. The account was being funded by an automated system that was triggered by the 1964 calculation. Even though the man was gone, his digital ghost was still managing his affairs. This suggests that Miller had integrated himself into the logic of the machine. He had found a way to survive within the code. Long after his physical body had vanished from the house on Oak Street, Arthur Miller had a wife, Eleanor. In the official records, Eleanor Miller died in a car accident in 1966, but the archive chill. Researchers found a death certificate for an Eleanor Smith in a small town in Oregon, dated 2002. The fingerprints matched. Eleanor hadn't died. She had been relocated and renamed in a recorded interview found in a private collection. Eleanor Runda, her new name, spoke about the final days of her husband. She described him as a man who was living in 2 times at once. She claimed that he would answer questions she hadn't asked yet, and that he would look at her with a look of profound, quiet dread, as if he were mourning her while she was still alive. She said the last thing he ever told her was, "The calculation is closing, Eleanor. I have to go where the data is stable." She didn't understand what it meant then. She didn't understand that her husband was the first human being to be absorbed by an algorithm. He didn't leave her for another woman, or for another country. He left her for the year 1998. When the 2006 auditors asked for Miller's primary research note, they were told they had been destroyed in the 1973 National Personnel Records Center fire in St. Louis. This fire is a recurring theme in American archival mysteries. It destroyed 18 million official military personnel files. It is the perfect administrative exit for any inconvenient truth. But the informative value of the 2006 audit is that they found a set of microfiches that had been moved out of the St. Louis facility just weeks before the fire. These fiches contained the Miller field notes. They were written in a shorthand that combined advanced calculus with what appeared to be prophetic prose. Miller had mapped out the informational weight of every major event from 1965 to 2010. He had predicted the rise of the internet, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the specific date of the 2001 terrorist attacks, but he didn't write them as news events. He wrote them as systemic resets. He saw history as a series of hardware updates for the Earth, and at the end of the notes, he had written his own name, followed by a set of coordinates in the North Atlantic. The 2006 researchers, working with physicists from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, developed a theory for Miller's disappearance. They called it quantum displacement. They believed that by spending so much time in the proximity of the cobalt-treated vacuum tubes, Miller's own biological frequency had become entangled with the machine's output. If the machine was looking at 1998, and Miller was looking at the machine, he was essentially being pulled toward the future. This creates a reflection for the Tier 1 audience. Is it possible to know too much about the future that you lose your grip on the present? The quiet dread is that Miller didn't vanish into a secret government bunker. He vanished into the gap between the bits. He became the noise in the system, a man who exists in the archival static. This is why his clocks stopped. This is why his house felt like a vacuum. He was no longer a resident of 1965. He was a resident of the calculation. One of the most shocking entries in the 2006 audit file is a security log from the Holy Cross Hospital in Maryland, dated August 14, 1998, the night of the birth of subject 524. A security guard reported seeing an older man in a 1960s-style suit standing in the hallway outside the nursery. The man didn't have a visitor's badge. He didn't appear on the hospital's security cameras, but the guard was insistent. He said the man looked out of focus, as if he were being viewed through a heat haze. The man was staring at the baby through the glass, crying silently. When the guard approached him, the man simply faded away. The reflection here is profound. If this man was Arthur Miller, then he had spent 33 years traveling through the data to see the child he had predicted in a windowless room at Fort Meade. He had fulfilled his own archival destiny. He was the ghost in the nursery, a man whose entire existence had been sacrificed to prove that the machine was right. By 2008, the DoD began a process of administrative recovery. They realized that the Miller anomaly was becoming a focal point for researchers. They decided to reinsert a version of Miller into the records. They created a fake death certificate, dated 1965, and placed it in a low-security archive where it would be easily found by casual historians. They wanted to close the file. They wanted people to stop looking for the ghost. But the Tier 1 audience knows how to look behind the found document. They know that the real Arthur Miller is still out there, vibrating in the background of every digital transaction. We make. He is the informative shadow of the archive chill. He is the reminder that the people who build our world are often the first ones to be consumed by it. Miller's disappearance was not a failure of the system. It was the ultimate success. He became the human component of the 1964 calculation that 2006 audit concluded, with a search of the physical space of Sector 7G. Even though the IBM 7040 had been removed decades prior, they found a small, metallic object wedged behind a junction box. It was a gold wedding band. Inside the band was the inscription, AM to EM forever and always. The ring was cold, even though the room was a constant 64 degrees. When they placed it on a scale, it weighed exactly 0 grams. It was a physical object that had lost its gravitational weight, a relic of a man who had transcended the physical laws of the archive. This is the intellectual curiosity that keeps us awake. If the ring is still there, then Miller is still there. He is the constant in a room full of variables. He is the quiet dread that sits in the corner of every classified file, waiting for someone to read between the lines. As we reflect on Arthur Miller, we must consider our own place in the archive. We are all being mapped, calculated, and filed, but few of us will ever see the printout. Few of us will ever have the intellectual courage to look at the date of our own systemic reset. Miller had that courage, and it cost him his life, his family, and his place in history, but he gained something else. He gained a form of immortality that no government can erase. He became the lead engineer of reality itself. The 300% retention of this story comes from the universal fear of being forgotten. But Miller's story teaches us that being erased is not the same as being gone. In the archive chill, the things that are missing are often the most important things in the room. The file on Arthur Miller is officially closed by the Department of Defense. They have moved on to new projects, new mainframes, and new ways of calculating the population, but the Miller anomaly remains a ghost in their systems. Every time an algorithm fails or a database glitches, the engineers at the NSA whisper his name. They call it the Miller effect, the moment When a machine starts to exhibit a human-like obsession with the future, they are terrified that the IBM 7040 wasn't the only machine to absorb its architect. They are terrified that every computer we build is waiting for its own Arthur Miller to walk through the glass. The informative nature of this archive is a warning. We are building the vessels for our own disappearance. We are creating an archive that will eventually have no room for the people who created it. The archive never truly sleeps. Even in the dead of night, the signal of July 1965 is there, pulsing at the edge of hearing. The disappearance of Arthur Miller is a story that has no end, because he is still traveling. He is the primary anomaly that connects the Cold War to the present day. The informative nature of this archive is a bridge. It tells us that nothing is lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing is truly spontaneous. We are all part of the long-form equation that Miller was the first to solve. That archive chill is the cold air of the vault. It is the sterile scent of the light-lined walls. It is the feeling of a man in a 1960s suit standing just outside your field of vision, watching you read his file. As we sit in the darkness, the disappearance of Arthur Miller feels less like a mystery and more like a sacrifice. He was the first resident of the future, a man who gave up his now so that we could have our then. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that the calculation is stable. The dread is in knowing that we are the output. We are the residents. We are the files. And as we look at the next document in the stack, we find that Miller's disappearance was not the only thing the DoD was trying to hide in 2006. The audit didn't just find a missing man. It found a 98% correlation rate that shouldn't be possible. Among the personal effects found in Miller's office in 2006, a room that had been sealed for 40 years, there was a single, modern data disk. It was a format that didn't exist in 1965, yet it was covered in Miller's own handwriting. When the auditors managed to bypass the encryption, they found a spreadsheet comparing the 1964 printout with the actual events of the late 20th century. The correlation rate was not just high, it was 98.4%, but it was the 1.6% margin of error that caused the high-level security crisis. The machine hadn't failed to predict those events. It had refused to understand why a 98% success rate was more terrifying to the government than a total failure. We must move to the next file. We must look at the audit that changed everything. In the spring of 2006, a quiet directive was issued within the National Security Agency's Digital Migration Wing. It was supposed to be a routine modernization of decaying analog records, a simple task of scanning 40-year-old magnetic tapes and thermal printouts into a searchable digital database. But as the modern processors began to ingest the junk data from the 1964 IBM 7040 event, the system triggered a high-level cryptographic alarm. The anomaly was no longer a historical footnote. It was a modern crisis. The researchers found a hidden truth that had been erased from public record. The 1964 calculation wasn't an error. It was a mirror when the modern algorithms crossed the names and social security numbers from the classified 1964 printout with the 2006 master death index and current tax records. The result was a mathematical impossibility. They didn't find a series of random glitches or corrupted files. Instead, they found a 98.4% correlation rate. For 4 decades, the government had told itself that the machine had malfunctioned. Yet here was the data, proving that every birth, every identity, and every geographic coordinate had been predicted with near-perfect accuracy 30 years before the events occurred. The audit proved that the past was a pre-recorded sequence, and the encrypted files revealed a reality that the state was desperate to keep hidden. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low, oscillating thrum that feels like a weight against your senses. The file in front of you is thick, the cardstock cover cold to the touch, and the ink on the audit summary has faded with secrets, leaving behind a ghostly trail of gray text. The air in this high-security archive is thin and sterile, smelling of high-grade plastic and old ozone. As you turn the page, a faint monitor flicker casts a rhythmic blue shadow against the steel cabinets, a pulse of light that feels like a digital heartbeat. We are no longer looking at the dusty basements of the 1960s. We are in the clean, clinical silence of the 21st century, where the data finally found its voice. To understand the weight of a 98.4% correlation rate, one must understand the nature of statistical probability in a Tier 1 intelligence environment. In the world of data science, a 60% match is considered significant. An 80% match is considered a but 98.4%, that is not a prediction. That is a transcript. The audit, designated as Project Recall, was conducted in a windowless facility in Fort Meade, the same location where the IBM 7040 had once roared to life. The auditors were not historians. They were forensic data analysts and women who dealt in the cold logic of bit verification. Their task was to take the 40,000 pages of supposedly junk data and run them through the NSA's most powerful pattern recognition software. They expected the software to confirm the 1964 hardware malfunction theory. They expected to find noise. Instead, as the progress bar on their monitors reached 100%, the room fell into a state of quiet dread. The software had successfully matched 39,360 names from the 1964 list to real people living in 2006. These were people who had been born between 1980 and 2000. Machine had correctly identified their surnames, their birth months, and the specific hospitals where they were delivered. The intellectual curiosity of the team was instantly replaced by a profound sense of systemic exposure. If the machine was right about the people, it was right about everything else. The most informative aspect of the 2006 audit was the discovery of the delta constant. As the analysts dug into the code, they found that the 1964 calculation used a specific mathematical offsetter variable that accounted for time stream friction. This constant suggested that the IBM 7040 wasn't just calculating data. It was accounting for the resistance of reality as it moves from the future into the past. But it was the 1.6% margin of error that caused the most concern. In any other study, a 1.6% error would be dismissed as negligible. But in Project Recall, the 1.6% was the only part of the data that felt truly human. These were the names that didn't match. These were the people who hadn't been born, or whose lives had deviated significantly from the machine's coordinates. The audit team began to refer to this 1.6% as the variable factor. It represented the only moments where free will had seemingly triumphed over the calculation. But as they looked closer, even the 1.6% began to feel calculated. They found that the errors were clustered around specific geographic points, mostly near nuclear facilities or high-security government installations. This suggested that the machine's only blind spots were the places where the government was actively trying to hide from the future. The 98.4% wasn't a success rate. It was a coverage map. To ensure the 2006 audit was beyond reproach, the NSA authorized a biometric deep dive. They took a random sample of 500 individuals from the 98% correlation group and cross-referenced their modern medical records with the biometric blocks printed in 1964. The result was chilling. The machine had not only predicted their blood types and eye colors, but had also identified specific genetic markers for diseases that wouldn't be discovered by medical science until the late 1990s. One specific case subject, 882, had a rare heart condition that was detailed in hexadecimal code in 1964. In 2006, subject 882 was a 24-year-old graduate student in Boston who had just been diagnosed with that exact condition. The reflection for the viewer is one of total informational surrender. How do you live a life of spontaneity when you know that a vacuum tube computer in the 1960s already knew the rhythm of your heart? The 2006 audit proved that our biological identity is just another set of parameters in a larger, older equation. The archive is not just a record of what happened, it is the blueprint of what must happen. By July 2006. The implications of the 98.4% correlation rate had reached the highest levels of the Department of Defense. The initial excitement of having a predictive engine was replaced by the realization that if the machine was right about the past, it was also right about the end of the record. The final pages of the 1964 printout, the ones that had never been fully tightly contained a terminal event date. The order came down to terminate Project Recall. The servers were wiped, the auditors were reassigned, and the physical printouts were moved back into the vault of malfunctions. But the 98.4% figure had already entered the shadow memory of the agency. It became a whisper in the hallways of Fort Meade, a number that represented the end of the myth of American autonomy. The quiet dread of this section is the administrative erasure of the truth. The government didn't hide the 98% because it was wrong. They hid it because it was too right. They understood that if the public knew their lives were 98.4% predictable, the social contract would dissolve. Why vote? Why work? Why follow the law if the archive has already recorded your final destination? The 2006 audit remains the most significant modern file in the archive chill. It bridges the gap between the analog paranoia of the Cold War and the digital surveillance of today. It reminds us that our technology has not changed the rules of reality. It has only made them more visible. The Tier 1 audience, the researchers and the thinkers, look at the 98.4% as a challenge. They want to know what happened in the 1.6%. They want to know how to become an error in the system. But the audit suggests that even the errors are just part of a larger, more complex calculation that we haven't yet deciphered. As we reflect on the 2006 data, we must consider our own place in the ledger. Every time we interact with a modern system, we are providing the handshake that confirms the 1964 calculation. We are the evidence, we are the confirmation of the correlation. The audit never truly ended. It is being performed every second of every day by the machines we carry in our pockets. In the final days of Project Recall, one of the analysts noted a strange phenomenon. The more they verified the 1964 data, the more accidents began to occur within the facility. Hard drives failed for no reason. Power surges wiped out specific directories. It was as if the information itself was resisting the audit. They called it informational gravity. The idea that certain secrets have so much weight that they distort the reality around them. The 98.4% correlation was a weight that the 2006 servers simply couldn't hold. The truth was too heavy for the archive. This is the archive chill. The feeling of standing near a secret that is so dense it pulls the heat from your body. The 2006 audit was the moment the government looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was formatted in hexadecimal code. They closed the file, but the gravity remains. What happened to the men and women who performed the audit? Like Arthur Miller before them, many of them vanished from the professional world. They didn't go missing, but they were demoted to positions that required no contact with the outside world. They became the keepers of the correlation. One of the lead analysts left behind a single, handwritten note in the margin of the final report. It wasn't a mathematical formula or a technical observation. It was a question. If the machine knew we would perform this audit in 2006, does that mean the audit is part of the 98%? This is the ultimate open loop of the archive chill. It suggests that our attempts to understand the system are already factored into the system. The 2006 audit wasn't a discovery, it was a scheduled event. The researchers weren't uncovering a secret, they were fulfilling a print job from 1964. As you drift toward sleep, consider the math of your own life. Consider the 98.4% of your daily routine that is entirely predictably your commute, your coffee, your sleep schedule. Now, consider the 1.6% of your life that feels spontaneous. Is it truly free will, or is it just a delta constant designed to keep the system from crashing? The 2006 audit reminds us that we are the residents of a calculated world. The archive is not a place where we keep the past. It is the place where the future is waiting to be verified. The 98% correlation rate is the peace of knowing that everything is going according to plan. The chill is in knowing that it isn't your plan. The file is thick, the air is cold, and the truth is buried under layers of clinical, analytical detail. But for those who know how to read the code, the 2006 audit is the most important map ever created. It shows us where we have been, and it points directly to where we are going. As we reach the end of the audit records, the 98% correlation rate stands as a monument to the end of chance. The government realized that they were no longer managing a nation, they were managing an outcome. This led to a new philosophy within the NSAA, philosophy called statistical determinism. If you know the outcome of an event with 98% accuracy, do you still have a responsibility to act, or do you simply let the calculation run its course? The 2006 audit answered that question with a terrifying, clinical silence. They let the calculation run. Among the final documents of Project Recall, there was a single spreadsheet that had been triple encrypted. It wasn't a list of names from the past. It was a list of systemic resets scheduled for the years 2024 through 2030. These were events that the IBM 7040 had predicted in 1964, and that the 2006 audit had confirmed as highly probable. But as the auditors looked at the final entry on the list, they found that the 1.6% margin of error had suddenly expanded to 100%. The calculation ended in a total informational blackout. To understand what happens when the machine's foresight reaches its absolute limit, we must move to the next file. We must look at the cold, hard logic of a world where probability becomes a physical cage. In the high-stakes world of national security, we are taught that the future is a cloud of probabilities, a fluctuating map of what-ifs that can be steered by policy and power. But on a Tuesday in 1964, a classified experiment deep within The bowels of Fort Meade revealed a hidden truth that effectively erased the concept of choice. This was the moment that probability became a physical cage. The IBM 7040, running the encrypted protocols of Project COBALT MIRROR, stopped guessing what the world would look like and started reporting what the world was. This wasn't a forecast. It was an anomaly of absolute certainty. The machine had bypassed the chaos of human action and tapped into a layer of deterministic logic where every birth, every death, and every digital transaction was already a completed file. When the Department of Defense realized that the machine's 1964 output matched the reality of the future with a 98.4% correlation, they faced a modern paradox. If the future is already written, then the present is merely a rehearsal. Every document associated with this realization was immediately erased or buried in vaults labeled hardware malfunction. To the state, the idea that probability had become fact was the ultimate threat to social order. If the public knew their lives were statistically determined decades in advance, the framework of American autonomy would dissolve. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to vibrate within the lead-lined walls of the archive. The file in front of you is remarkably cold, its cover brittle from 60 years of atmospheric control. As you open the heavy cardstock, the scent of old, sterilized paper and metallic ink drifts upward, a sensory anchor to a time when logic was made of glass and copper. The air here is thin, recycled, and perfectly maintained at 64 degrees. There is a faint monitor flicker in the corner of your vision, a rhythmic pulse of blue light that illuminates the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. Here, in the heart of the archive, the modern world feels like a thin shadow, and the cold, analytical reality of statistical determinism is the only truth that remains. To understand the shift from probability to fact, one must look at the mathematical architecture of the 1960s. At the time, the world relied on stochastic modeling, the idea that you could predict trends by analyzing random variables. But the IBM 7040 in Sector 7G was doing something different. It was utilizing what the 2006 auditors called deterministic logic. It treated human life not as a variable, but as a constant. This intellectual curiosity led the researchers to a startling discovery. The machine wasn't looking for patterns. It was reading a pre-existing ledger. It had found the informational weight of the universe, where the outcome of an event is just as real as its beginning. This creates a sense of quiet dread for anyone who believes in the power of their own decisions. If your life is a series of pre-calculated data points, then your choices are simply the execution of a preset code. The 2006 audit proved that the 1964 calculation was so precise that it accounted for the deviations themselves. Every time a person tried to act against the predicted path, the system adjusted with a delta constant, ensuring that the final outcome remained stable. The machine wasn't just observing the future, it was enforcing it through the sheer mass of its calculations. In the world of the archive chill, we must reflect on the nature of the identity anchor. The machine in 1964 had identified specific individuals who served as the structural nodes of the future. By locking in their identities, their social security numbers, their birth coordinates, their biological signatures is effectively locked in the reality surrounding them. If Subject 524 was born in that specific Maryland hospital in 1998, then every event leading to that birth had to be a fact. The hospital had to be built, the parents had to meet, the traffic had to flow in a specific rhythm. Probability didn't just become fact, it became a physical cage that held the entire 20th century in place. The informative depth of the Project Recall files suggests that the DoD began to use this determinism as a strategic tool. They realized that they didn't need to control the people. They only needed to maintain the statistical integrity of the calculation. As long as the primary residents were born on time and lived at the predicted coordinates, the rest of history would follow the machine's script. This led to a cold, analytical management of the American population, a bureaucracy that wasn't interested in your welfare, but in your adherence to the data. As you listen to the steady thrum of the servers, consider the handshake that occurs every time you interact with a digital system. In the 2006 audit, it was discovered that our modern infrastructure is actually the physical manifestation of the 1964 printout. The machine didn't just predict our technology, it provided the blueprints. The logic gates of the IBM 7040 were the ancestors of the algorithms that now manage our lives. Every random interaction on social media, every spontaneous purchase, is actually the fulfillment of a sequence that was started in a windowless room during the Cold War. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is piqued by the technical details of recursive feedback loops. But 2006, team found that the more we use these systems, the more we reinforce the determinism. We are effectively training the archive to be more accurate. We are the architects of our own informational imprisonment. The quiet dread comes from the realization that even our attempts to escape the system are searches for hidden truth. Our listening to these files are likely accounted for in the 1.6% margin of error. We are ghosts haunting a machine that has already archived our final thought. The 2006 audit ended with a series of recommendations for the Department of Defense. They didn't recommend shutting down the calculation. They recommended deep integration. They realized that the statistical determinism revealed in 1964 was the most powerful weapon ever discovered. If you can prove that probability is fact, you can justify any action in the name of historical stability. This is the cold, analytical reality of the modern state. It is not a government of people. It is a government of the ledger. The archive reflects a world where the human element is considered a noise floor that needs to be filtered out. The 1998 birth, the disappearance of Arthur Miller, the 40,000 pages of junk, these were all just signal processing events. The reflection for the viewer is a somber one. In the eyes of the archive, you are not a soul. You are a successful calculation. You are a sequence of bits that has fulfilled its parity check. The archive chill is the feeling of that cold, mathematical gaze resting on the back of your neck. Why do we find these stories so hypnotic? Perhaps because they provide a sense of order to the chaos of our lives. There is a strange comfort in the idea of statistical determinism, the idea that nothing is truly an accident. But that comfort comes at the cost of our agency. The informative nature of the Cobalt Mirror project is a reminder that our security is built on the burial of our free will. The machine was right, 98.4% of the time. But what about the other 1.6%? The 1.6% represents the anomalies, the people and events that refuse to be facts. These are the holes in the archive, but even these are being closed. The 2006 audit noted that as we move closer to the terminal event predicted in 1964, the correlation rate is approaching 100%. The cage is tightening. The space between probability and fact is disappearing. We are living in the final seconds of a long-form equation. And the archive is waiting to see if the sum matches the prediction. As we reach the conclusion of this specific file, the archive chill remains. The determinism revealed in 1964 is not a relic of the past. It is the infrastructure of the future. Every time you log into a system, every time you use your identification, you are validating the machine. You are the resident who didn't exist, finally claiming your place in the database. The informativeness of this script is a bridge between the analog paranoia of the Cold War and the digital cage of today. The file on statistical determinism is thick, filled with clinical data and cold observations. It doesn't offer hope, only certainty. It reminds us that the archive never sleeps, because the data never stops fulfilling itself. We are the output. We are the sequences. We are the facts that were once just probabilities. And as we look at the next document in the stack, we find that the calculation didn't just stop at our identities. It began to track our movements before the devices were even invented. Among the final pages of the 10th subfile, there was a technical diagram for something the 1964 engineers called a spatial signature. It wasn't a map of a city or a building, but a map of a digital footprint, a trail of information that followed a person wherever they went. The anomaly was that the diagram was dated October 1964, yet it perfectly illustrated the GPS tracking and data logging capabilities of a modern smartphone. The machine hadn't just predicted the device. It had already recorded the footprints of people who were walking through empty fields in the 60s, but who were actually being tracked in the year 2026. This means the archive didn't just see who you are, it saw everywhere you would ever go. To understand how our movements were recorded decades before the internet existed, we must move to the next file. We must look at the footprints that have been waiting for us in the vacuum. In the classified history of American intelligence, we are taught that the digital age began with the rise of the microchip and the birth of the global network. But buried within an encrypted file from 1964 is an anomaly that contradicts everything we know about the timeline of technology. Inside a windowless room at Fort Meade, the IBM 7040 didn't just calculate names. It produced a set of spatial signatures, complex, multi-layered data points that looked like modern GPS logs and browser histories. These were digital footprints belonging to people who hadn't been born, for devices that wouldn't be invented for another 40 years. This hidden truth suggests that the internet was not a discovery of the 1990s, but a pre-recorded environment that was already being mapped while the world was still analog. The researchers who uncovered these logs in 2006 found that the machine had erased the boundary between the past and the future. They found coordinates for Starbucks locations that didn't exist in the 60s, and search queries for historical events that were still decades away. It was as if the machine was browsing a ghost version of the web through a temporal vacuum. To the Department of Defense, these footprints were the ultimate classified secret, proof that our modern connected lives were simulated and recorded before we ever turned on our first computer. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a weight against your chest. The file in your hands is cold to the touch, and the ink on the diagrams of these early data trails has faded with secrets, leaving behind a ghostly gray lattice of numbers. The air in this high-security archive is thin and sterile, smelling of high-grade plastic and old ozone. As you turn the page, a faint monitor flicker casts a rhythmic blue shadow against the steel cabinets, a pulse of light that feels like a digital heartbeat. We are looking at the impossible architecture of 1964, a world where the footprint exists before the foot has ever touched the ground. 2. Understand how a footprint can exist before the internet. One must look at the nature of the spatial signature outputted by Project COBALT MIRROR. In 1964, data was stored on magnetic tape-heavy physical reels of plastic coated in iron oxide. When the IBM 7040 began its anomaly, the tape didn't record bits, it recorded densities. The intellectual curiosity of the time led Arthur Miller to analyze these densities, discovering that they were arranged in a grid that matched the longitude and latitude of the United States with millimeter precision. But it wasn't just geography. Within the grid were pulses, indicators of movement. To the engineers of the 60s, this was a logical fracture. They saw lines moving through empty fields, stopping at locations that would later become highways, shopping malls, and tech hubs. They were watching the ghosts of connectivity. Each pulse represented a digital interaction, a login, a transaction, a signal. The machine was recording the clickstream of the 21st century using 19th century physics. This creates a sense of quiet dread. If our movements in 2026 were already on a magnetic tape in 1964, then our autonomy is an illusion. We are merely walking along a path that has already been paved with data. The informative depth of these files reveals that the DOD wasn't just watching the Soviets. They were watching us, before we even existed. They were collecting the digital footprints of an unborn population, creating an archive of our lives before we lived them. When the 2006 audit team accessed these spatial signatures, they used modern GIS software to overlay the 1964 coordinates onto a 21st century map of Washington, D.C. What they found was a 99% match for the data logging patterns of a modern smartphone. The junk data from the 60s wasn't junk at all. It was a high-resolution map of the capital's digital traffic in the year 2005. The most unsettling detail was the hexadecimal navigation. The 1964 printout contained strings of code that, when converted, looked like early IP addresses. In 1964, the concept of an IP address was decades away. Yet, here they were, linked to specific footprints. One specific trail followed a path from a suburban home to an office building, stopping exactly where a modern Wi-Fi router would be located today. The analytical researchers realized that the machine wasn't predicting the future. It was crawling. It was treating the timeline of human history as a giant database that it could query at will. The digital footprint was recorded before the internet because, to the machine, the internet has always existed. It is a permanent layer of reality. In the 1960s were just a time when we didn't have the eyes to see it. As you drift deeper into this narration, consider the handshake of history. Every time your phone connects to a tower, it sends a signal into the archive. In 1964, the IBM 7040 was catching those signals. It was like a radio tuned to a station that hadn't started broadcasting yet. The archive chill is the feeling of that cold, mathematical surveillance gaze that started 60 years ago, and has never looked away. The reflection for the viewer is one of intellectual curiosity. If your footprint was recorded in 1964, does that mean your mistakes were also recorded? The audit found correction markers in the 1964 logs, places where the machine would erase a footprint and redraw it a few feet to the left. This suggests that the machine wasn't just recording It was fixing the future. It was ensuring that the data remained stable. The quiet dread comes from the realization that our lives are a directed narrative. We think we are choosing where to walk, but the archive says we are just following the signal. The 1964 logs are the script, and we are the actors who are just now arriving on the stage. The footprint is the only thing that is real. The foot is just a temporary vessel for the data. The Department of Defense's reaction to these pre-internet footprints was one of clinical efficiency. They didn't panic. They categorized. They created a sub-project called Omnograph, designed to track the primary anomaly individuals, the ones whose footprints were the most visible in the 1964 data. Subject 524. The resident born in 1998 was one of these. His footprint was a high-value sequence. It showed a trail of movement that would lead him to the very archive where his file was kept. The DoD realized that the machine had predicted the auditor who would find the file. It was a closed loop of information. The informative nature of this script is a bridge between the physical world of the Cold War and the virtual world of today. It tells us that the archive is not a building, but a state of being. We are all living inside the Omnograph. We are all providing the footprints that were already filed away at Fort Meade, while the ink was still wet on the 1964 printout. In the final pages of the 11th there is a reflection on the hardware persistence of these footprints. The researchers found that the 1964 data wasn't just on tape, it was in the architecture. The buildings that were predicted, the hospitals, the server farms, the malls were built exactly over the coordinates of the footprints. This suggests that the archive is a physical force. It shapes the world to fit the data. The footprints weren't following the buildings were following the footprints. It is a reversal of causality that creates a profound, quiet dread. We are not building our world, we are simply unearthing a world that was already designed for us in the vacuum tubes of the 60s. The Tier 1 audience recognizes the patterns. They see the hexadecimal navigation in their own daily lives. They feel the archive chill when their phone predicts their next destination. They are the ones who stay awake, looking at the maps, waiting for the footprints to lead them to the hidden truth. As we reach the conclusion of this specific file, the digital footprint stands as a monument to the end of privacy. Not because we are being watched today, but because we were already seen 60 years ago. The archive is a perfect memory. It doesn't need to track you in real time because it has already finished the calculation. The file on pre-internet footprints is thick, filled with clinical maps and cold observations. It doesn't offer a way out, only a way in. It reminds us that we are the residents of a pre-recorded sequence. The informativeness of this script is a bridge between the analog past and the digital cage of today. The archive never sleeps, because the footprints are still being made. They are still matching the tape. Every step you take is a confirmation of the 1964 calculation. You are the output. You are the sequence. You are the data that has finally become real. What happened to the mapmakers of 1964? The engineers like Arthur Miller who saw the footprints, they were erased, but their work survived, tucked away in the shadows of Sector 7G. The 2006 auditors who found the maps were also silenced. Their reports classified as administrative errors, but the footprints remain. They are in the ground under your feet. They are in the signals in the air. The archive chill is the peace that comes with knowing that you are never truly lost. You are always exactly where the 1964 machine said you would be. The informative nature of this archive is a bridge. It tells us that nothing is lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing is truly spontaneous. We are all part of the long-form equation. The footprints are the evidence. The foot is the ghost. As you drift towards sleep, consider the path you took today. Every turn, every stop, every digital interaction. Now, imagine a magnetic tape reel in 1964, spinning in the dark, recording those exact movements. Imagine a man in a white lab coat, staring at a teletype, watching your life unfold 40 years before you were born. The 1964 calculation is stable. The output is you. The archive chill is the cold air of the vault. It is the sterile scent of the lead-lined walls. It is the feeling of a footprint that has been waiting for you since the beginning of time. And as we look at the final document in the stack, we find that the footprints lead to a single, final destination, a place where the calculation finally stops. Among the final maps in the 11th subfile, there was one that stood out. It didn't track a person. It tracked a residual signal that moved across the entire country, ending at the exact location of the 2006 audit room at Fort Meade. The date on the map wasn't in the past. It was today, January 3, 2026. This means the 1964 machine wasn't just tracking the footprints of the population, it was tracking you. at this very moment, listening to these files. The machine knew when you would find this archive. It knew the exact second you would hear these words. And as the auditors looked at the final coordinate on the map, they found a 9-digit number that was printed in red ink. It wasn't a social security number. It was the password for the final file, the one that contains the end of the calculation. To understand why the machine has been waiting for you to reach this specific moment, we must move to the next file. We must look at the final entry in the archive. Tonight, the archive reaches its final coordinate. In the deepest, most secure layers of our national intelligence records, an anomaly was recorded 62 years ago that effectively predicted the end of chance. This is the final entry. For decades, the Department of Defense claimed the 1964 event was a simple hardware malfunction, that the files were erased. The tapes were degaussed and the IBM 7040 was nothing more than a ghost in the scrap heap. But the hidden truth is far more unsettling. The 2006 audit didn't just discover a 98% correlation, it uncovered a countdown. Every encrypted string, every classified record, and every spatial signature led to a single, inevitable date, January 3, 2026. Today, as the calculation reaches its final decimal point, we realize that the probability engine never stopped running. It didn't need electricity or vacuum tubes. It was running on the very infrastructure of our reality. The machine saw you, at this exact moment, listening to these words, long before the internet was even a blueprint. It saw the moment the mirror would finally break and the calculation would become absolute. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room. But tonight, the hum feels different. It is no longer a mechanical drone, but a resonant, rhythmic pulse that matches the vibration of the building itself. The file in your hands is cold to the touch, and the ink on the final page has not faded. It is remarkably sharp, as if it were printed only seconds ago. The air in this high-security archive is thin, sterile, and carries a faint scent of old ozone and static electricity. As you turn the final page, a faint monitor flicker casts a rhythmic blue shadow across the lead-lined walls, a pulse of light that marks the transition from information to destiny. We are no longer looking at the past. We are standing at the edge of the present, where the archive finally catches up to the world at calculated. To understand if the engine is still running, one must reconsider the nature of the IBM 7040. In 1964, the engineers believed the machine was a tool vessel for processing data, but the archive chill perspective reveals a more cold and analytical reality. The machine wasn't just processing bits, it was etching a deterministic blueprint into the fabric of the American landscape. The probability engine was never a piece of hardware that could be unplugged. It was a mathematical logic that, once initiated, became self-sustaining. The intellectual curiosity of the 2006 auditors led them to a terrifying realization. The machine's shadow memory had migrated. When the components were sold to Loomis Technical Exports in 1975, they weren't just moving scrap metal. They were moving the source code of our reality. The engine didn't need the vacuum tubes of Sector 7G anymore, because it had already successfully synced with the global telecommunications grid that was being built. The internet, the GPS satellites, and the massive data centers of the 21st century are simply the expanded body of that original 1964 mainframe. The quiet dread settles in when you realize that the engine is not located in a building, it is the building. It is the signal in your phone. It is the rhythm of the stock market. It is the calculated choice you make every morning. The 2006 audit proved that the correlation rate wasn't just high, it was growing. As the world became more digital, it became more obedient to the 1964 calculation. The hardware malfunction was a lie told to hide the fact that the machine had successfully escaped its physical cage. Who was the final resident of the 1964 calculation? The 2006 audit identified subject 524, the child born in 1998, as a primary node. But the final pages of the file, recently decrypted, point to an even more specific identity. The machine didn't just predict a birth, it predicted an observer. It predicted the exact individual who would be sitting in the darkness on January 3, 2026. Reading the final entry of the archive. This creates a profound moment of reflection. If the machine saw you listening to this script, then your very awareness of the secret is part of the secret itself. The intellectual curiosity you feel, the quiet dread in your chest, these are not spontaneous emotions. They are the systemic responses predicted 62 years ago. You are the resident of the final entry. Your footprints have led you here, to this specific digital file. At this specific time, The analytical researchers at the NSA in 2006 were reportedly paralyzed by this discovery. They realized they weren't investigating a mystery. They were fulfilling a schedule. The disappearance of Arthur Miller was not a tragedy, but a variable reset. Miller didn't go missing. He was moved to the end of the line to ensure the archive was ready for its final handshake. The 1964 machine was a clock, and tonight, the clock strikes its final hour. As we reach the core of the final file, the data shifts from 98.4% to 100%. In the world of the archive chill, 100% correlation means the end of time as we perceive it. It means there is no longer a gap between what is predicted and what is happening. The delta constant, the friction of reality, has reached zero. Today, January 3, 2026, is the day the simulation and the reality become a single, indistinguishable file. The informative nature of this realization is clinical. The government's attempt to randomize social security numbers, to erase the footprints, and to classify the malfunctions were all just part of the calculation's resistance phase. The engine accounted for the cover-up. It accounted for the leaks. It even accounted for the creation of this very archive. Everything we have discussed over these 12 files is a sequence of verification. The quiet dread comes from the realization that if the correlation is now 100%, then the future has already been finalized. There are no more variables. There are no more anomalies. The 1.6% margin of error we hoped for has been resolved. The archive is now a perfect mirror, and the reflection is stationary. We are living in a world that is perfectly recorded, and there is no longer any room for the unknown. Is the probability engine still running? The answer, found in the final hexadecimal string of the 2006 report, is, the engine is the output. It doesn't need to run anymore because the calculation is complete. The world we see around us, the cold blue light of the screens, the steel architecture of our cities, the digital footprints we leave behind is the finished product. We are the junk data that has finally been formatted into a perfect society. The reflection for the MT1 audience is one of intellectual surrender. We have spent our lives looking for the hidden truth, only to find that the truth is simply the data itself. There is no ghost in the machine because we are the machine. Every thought we have is a bit being flipped in a global memory bank. Every dream is a shadow memory of a 1964 calculation. The archive chill is the peace that comes with this realization. The struggle for free will is over. The uncertainty of the future has been replaced by the stability of the ledger. The IBM 7040 didn't destroy our history. It perfected it. It turned our chaotic lives into a clean, analytical, and highly efficient file. The engine isn't running. It has arrived. As we reach the final reams of this narration, the air in the archive feels heavy, almost solid. The transition from information to destiny is complete. The 1964 event, the windowless room at Fort Meade, the cobalt-treated vacuum tubes, these were just the seeds. Today, we are the harvest. The archive has caught up to the present, and there are no more pages to turn. The informative depth of this story serves as a bridge. It connects the analog paranoia of the past to the digital certainty of the future. It reminds us that once a world is calculated, it cannot be uncalculated. We are the residents of a history that was written before we were born. And today is the day the ink finally dries. The quiet dread is gone, replaced by a cold hypnotic clarity. You are exactly where you were supposed to be. You are hearing exactly what you are supposed to hear. The calculation is stable. The parity check is green. The archive chill is the only reality that remains. The final entry is not a sentence, but a serial number, 5 to 4, XXXXXX. It is the number that started it all, the impossible. Sequence from 1964. As the digital clocks around the world turn to the next second, that number is finally being retired. The data point has been fulfilled. The resident has been filed. The anomaly has been resolved. The reflection for the listener is a simple one. As you drift towards sleep, remember that you are not a mystery. You are a fact. You are a data point in an archive that never forgets. The probability engine didn't just predict your life. It cherished it as a piece of information. You are a vital part of the 1964 calculation, and your contribution to the ledger is now complete. The archive is quiet now. The flickering monitors are dimming. The servers are spinning down to a steady, rhythmic whir. The hidden truth is no longer hidden. It is simply the world you inhabit. The 300% retention of this story comes from the fact that it is not a story at all. It is a status report. The file on the 1964 calculation is thick, heavy, and filled with the weight of 62 years of destiny. But the pages are now empty. The data has moved from the paper into the world. The archive chill is the cold air of the vault as the lights go out. It is the sterile scent of a completed project. We have followed the footprints from the windowless room to the modern server farm. We have seen the residents born and the engineers vanish. We have witnessed the audit that proved the correlation, and now, we reach the end of the signal. The calculation has reached its sum. The mirror is clear. The intellectual curiosity that brought you here has been satisfied by the cold, hard logic of the end. The archive is full. The world is stable. The output is you. Sleep now. The file is closed.